Preface and Chapter 1 of Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand, a record of the first exploration of the chief glaciers and ranges of the Southern Alps. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. gailtimmerman-vaughan.co.nz. Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand, a record of the first exploration of the chief glaciers and ranges of the Southern Alps, by Arthur Paul Harper. Preface and Chapter 1. In the years 1889, 1890, 1891, 1892, I made holiday expeditions to the Tasman district of the Southern Alps, and in 1893, 1894, 1895, was employed by the New Zealand government to explore the valleys and glaciers of the west coast of the South Island. I do not pretend to have made many high ascents, but base my claim to be considered an authority on the Alps of New Zealand on the fact that I have shared in the first exploration of nearly every glacier in the central position of these mountains. It is not right, in my opinion, for one who has special knowledge on a subject of general interest to keep that knowledge to himself, and for this reason, as well as with the object of recording our work and helping others by our experiences, I have ventured to write the following pages. The work of map-making and topographical exploration is sometimes undervalued, and a man's capabilities and exploits too often estimated by the number of high ascents made and new routes discovered by him, without considering the usefulness of the results. It is impossible to map the country without a vast deal of hard and more or less monotonous work, and those who in after years make use of the maps are apt to forget this. We too frequently find climbers ignoring those who have preceded them and whose work has materially helped them. Some even attempt to add to their own exploits by omitting to acknowledge their predecessors' work. This is especially the case in the opening up of a country that is little known, and it is therefore right that a record of the first explorations should be made. I have, in the following pages, recorded all the pioneer work which has materially contributed to the present topographical knowledge of the central portion of the Southern Alps. Not having studied any of the standard books on glacier science, my theories and conclusions are the results of the observations of several years, and I may have dwelt unnecessarily on points which are well known to those who are authorities on the subject. Of adventures we had, of course, enough to satisfy any ordinary human beings, but they were so bound up with the work that we were apt to take them as a matter of course. I have, however, in recording our progress, described a sufficient number to convey an idea of the conditions under which the work had to be carried out. If the life was rough, I fear my account of it is rougher, but hope that the facts here set down may be none the less interesting because they appear in somewhat crude language. Should any fellow member of the Alpine Club decide to come and climb our peaks, I shall be only too glad to give him all the information in my power, and trust that he will take this offer seriously and write to me should he need advice. The map published in this volume has already appeared, excepting a few additional details which I have since added in Mr. E. A. Fitzgerald's publication. Before leaving the survey office in Hokitika, I helped the draftsman to record the results of Mr. Douglas's and my work on the map at Mr. Fitzgerald's request, in order that the tracing which was sent to him might be, quote, up to date, end quote. For though the last of the unexplored country had been mapped by us before his arrival in New Zealand, it had not been transferred to the standard map. Arthur P. Harper, January 1896. Note: it is considered desirable to state that the letter announcing the transmission of the manuscript of Mr. Harper's book is dated Christchurch, New Zealand, March 18, 1896. The manuscript was received in England on May 18th. T. Fisher Unwin. End of note. Chapter 1. Introductory remarks on the Southern Alps and climbing in New Zealand. The main features of the mountain system of the South Island of New Zealand are tolerably well known and need only be generally referred to here. Beginning at the north end of the South Island, we find, in Nelson and Marlborough provinces, numerous ranges spreading from coast to coast and reaching in some instances an altitude of 9,000 feet. Amongst these hills very little flat land is to be found, though there is a vast area of low undulating grass and forest country well fitted for pastoral purposes. Though no glaciers exist in this part of the island, there are many grand peaks on which snow is found during most of the year, while the lower spurs are often clothed with luxuriant forest, of which a considerable area has been cleared and opened up for settlement. Further south, these ranges draw together till, in the Southern Alps, they form a great mountain wall running from northeast to southwest, which sends off a number of spurs rising into bold, ice-clad peaks, and for upwards of 100 miles presents a snowy barrier between the west and east coast districts. To the eastward, the Southern Alps send out great buttresses or offshoots, terminating suddenly in the broad Canterbury and Mackenzie plains, which form, by their absolute flatness and vast extent, a striking contrast to the peaks behind. To the westward, they slope rapidly, and in many cases fall in sheer precipices for some thousands of feet to the coast, leaving about 10 miles of comparatively level country between them and the sea, until the Sounds of Otago are reached. Here, in the province of Otago, the chain spreads out again from coast to coast in lower hills, amongst which are flourishing farms and sheep stations on the eastern side of the island, while on the westward side the mountains rise abruptly out of the sea to a great height. Amongst the Otago hills lie the beautiful lakes of Wakatipu, Tianau, Wanaka, etc., which are backed by Mounts Aspiring, Earnslaw, and other fine alpine peaks, reaching in some instances over 9,000 feet. As the subject matter of this book is confined to the central portion of the Southern Alps, amongst the larger glaciers and highest peaks, a short description of the general topography of the mountains to the north and south of that district will be sufficient. Between Christchurch on the east coast and Hokitika on the west coast, a coach road, unsurpassed by any I have seen elsewhere, runs over Arthur's Pass at an altitude of a little over 3,000 feet. A railway presenting some formidable engineering difficulties is now in course of construction by this route. For some distances south of Arthur's Pass, the Southern Alps only rise above the snow line in the peaks, there being many passes free from snow in the summer. Many fine glaciers exist, however, at the head of the Waimakariri River, which rises near the pass and flows eastward. South of this river is the Rakaia, which makes its rise from the glaciers on the main range, and those of Mount Arrowsmith and the surrounding peaks, the chief sources being the Ramsay and Lyell glaciers, both of considerable size. The latter at present is practically unexplored. The peaks in this locality are very fine, the chief one Mount Arrowsmith, 9,171 feet, being an offshoot of the main range and forming a splendid group of rock peaks. Comparatively little beyond general information is known of this locality from an alpine point of view. Only 1 or 2 parties have been there for short visits, but it is easily accessible, as there are sheep stations and homesteads within easy reach of the chief points of interest. Note: New Zealand Alpine Journal, Volume 1, page 142, end of note. Alpine passes ought to be found over the dividing range without difficulty at this point, and no doubt before long we shall have more accurate and detailed knowledge of what ought to prove a very interesting district. The only record of a transalpine pass in this district is that made by Mr. G.J. Roberts and his survey party in the 70s, when he ascended a branch of the Wanganui River on the west coast and reached the watershed. Afterwards, the same party, having come round by coach to Canterbury, carried their triangulation up the Rakaia River and joined the west and east coast surveys, ascending to the same point on the divide, thus proving a pass practicable. South of the Rakaia, the Rangitata River flows from 2 or 3 glaciers of more or less second-rate importance, as compared with other alpine districts. Note: New Zealand Alpine Journal, Volume 1, page 22, end of note. Here again we find some fine peaks lying on spurs of the main range. The highest peak in this district is Mount Tyndall, on the divide itself, but practically unknown, as indeed is the whole of this district above the snow line. The next and last river flowing to the east coast, which need be mentioned, is the Waitaki River, one of the largest in the South Island. Its 2 main branches take their rise from the chief glaciers on the eastern slopes of the main range. The northern branch comes from the Glasson and Godley glaciers, under the name of the Godley River, flowing into Lake Tekapo, and leaves it as the Tekapo River till it unites with the Pukaki River. The main or central branch comes from the 4 great glaciers, the Murchison, Tasman, Hooker, and Muller, and flows for 30 miles under the name of Tasman River into Lake Pukaki, and thence continues as the Pukaki River until it is joined by the Tekapo River, the 2 forming, with other more southerly tributaries, the great Waitaki River. my personal explorations on the eastern slopes of the Southern Alps have been confined to the headwaters and glaciers of the central branch of this river, and I shall give more detailed information of that district in a later chapter. The western slopes and offshoots of the main range are very precipitous, and the rivers, though of considerable size, are comparatively short and, descending very rapidly, have cut deep, impassable gorges through the mountains. Unlike the eastern slopes, which are nearly all open, tussocky, grass-covered country, the west coast ranges are covered with dense forest to a height of 3,500 feet to 4,000 feet. Beginning at Arthur's Pass, on the western side, the first river south is the Hokitika, which takes its rise from small glaciers on the dividing range and corresponds to the Rakaia and Waimakariri on the east. Some 30 miles farther south is the Wanganui River, which drains a large part of the main range and has 4 or 5 large branches, at the head of which are glaciers of second-rate size. This river has never been explored, except the one branch up which Mr. Roberts went in the 70s, and I believe that it heads the southern tributaries of the Rakaia River and part of the Rangitata. About 20 miles further down the coast is the Wataroa, another large river, draining the main range at the head of the Rangitata, Godley, and Murchison glaciers. It also has many large branches in the mountains, up which, no doubt, there are considerable snowfields and some fair-sized glaciers, but except the tributary coming from the Sealy Pass at the head of the Godley Glacier, it may be said to be terra incognita. Some 15 miles below the Wataroa is the Waiho, which takes its rise from some magnificent glaciers, namely the Burton, Spencer, and Franz Joseph, from the head of which saddles lead into the upper portion of the Tasman Glacier. Still travelling south along the beach, we come to Cook River, some 20 miles below the Waiho. This river has 3 branches and draws its supplies from the Fox, the Balfour, and La Perouse glaciers, all of first-class importance. Though these streams flow into the sea some distance apart, they are all closely connected in the ranges, separated only by narrow ridges over which passes could easily be made. Below Cook River, the Karangarua River flows into the sea at a distance of some 6 miles. It also takes its rise from large glaciers and has 3 branches: the Copeland River from the Strauchan and Marchant glaciers, the Twain River from the Horace Walker, Douglas, and Fitzgerald glaciers, and the main branch from no particular ice field, but draining the northern end of the Hooker Range. These last 3 rivers, the Waiho, Cook, and Karangarua, draw their supplies from the highest and most important part of the Southern Alps, and correspond with the Tasman River on the eastern side. At the head of the Karangarua, a saddle leads into the Landsborough River, which takes its rise from 4 or 5 first-class glaciers, and flows southward along the foot of the main range for 40 miles. On its right bank, the Hooker Range, a large and important offshoot of the main range, prevents it from finding a direct course to the sea. After flowing for 40 miles between these 2 mountain chains, the river takes a sweep round to the west and finds its way to the Tasman Ocean at a point 65 miles from the McCarrow Glacier at its head. It is joined at the bend, 40 miles below the McCarrow Glacier, by the Haast, a small, unimportant stream coming from the pass of that name, and for some unexplained reason giving its name to the main river from the junction to the sea. From the Rakaia River to a point 20 miles down the Landsborough Valley, the main chain practically rises above the snow line the whole way, sending off long spurs or ranges on the east, and more precipitous ones on the west. The peaks themselves gradually become higher, till in Mount Tasman, 11,475 feet, the divide reaches its highest point, Mount Cook, 12,349 feet, being an offshoot of the main range, and sending down all its drainage eastward into the Waitaki. South of Mount Tasman, the peaks gradually become lower, and the range assumes a rocky, saw-toothed form, sending up high rock peaks with low saddles between them which, as the Haast Pass is approached, are uncovered by snow in the summer. The Haast Pass itself is the best transinsular route, being only 1,800 feet above sea level. Below this pass there are again fine mountain groups rising to nearly 10,000 feet, containing many magnificent ice-clad summits and glaciers of no small size. The principal of these are Aspiring, Lydia, Robinson, Earnslaw, the Ark, Castor, and Pollux, etc., all untouched from an alpine point of view, with the exception of Earnslaw, a fairly easy peak by all accounts, near Lake Wakatipu. A few miles south of Mount Sefton, which lies at the head of the Twain River, the Hooker Range branches off from the main divide and continues some 40 or 50 miles south. This range is higher and carries far more perpetual snow and ice on it than the dividing range which runs parallel with it. For though the latter has many peaks rising to a considerable altitude, which would be covered with perpetual snow if situated a little north or south of their position, yet it is a noteworthy fact that here they are almost devoid of ice. The only reason I can give for this state of things is that the Hooker Range, being higher, cuts off the moist sea winds from the main range, thus causing a smaller annual snowfall. The principal glaciers and ice-clad peaks of the Southern Alps lie between latitude 43 degrees and 45 degrees south, and in spite of the fact that this is nearer the equator than the Alps in Switzerland, the snow line is much lower here than in Europe, and our glaciers descend to lower limits. Taken as a whole, I consider that the perpetual snow line in these mountains lies between 6,000 and 6,500 feet, or nearly 3,000 feet lower than in Switzerland. I have seen 1 or 2 peaks off the main divide which have snow on them all the summer from 5,000 feet upwards, but these are exceptions caused by their shape and position. The glaciers descend to an extraordinarily low level. On the eastern side, the terminal face of the Tasman is only 2,354 feet above the sea, and the Muller and Hooker 2,500 and 2,882 feet respectively. On the western side, this peculiarity is still more marked. The Franz Josef Glacier on the Waiho River has its terminal face in latitude south 43 degrees, 25 minutes 30 seconds, and though it is within 14 miles of the sea, it lies only 692 feet above sea level. The Fox Glacier, a few miles further south, descends to within 10 miles of the beach and to 670 feet of sea level. The Balfour Glacier, at the head of the central branch of the Cook River, has its terminal face at an altitude of 2,300 feet. These facts at first sight appear to be extraordinary, but I think they might be accounted for by the peculiar climatic conditions prevailing in New Zealand. The northerly and westerly winds, which so frequently come over the Tasman Sea, carry an immense amount of moisture, and within a few miles of the coast they meet with the Great Wall of the Southern Alps. The consequence is a very heavy rainfall in some parts of the ranges, amounting probably to 140 inches in the year. Even at Hokitika, on the sea beach, the fall reaches 126 inches, and it is far heavier in the mountains. This great rainfall, combined with the height of the mountain wall which the wind meets, and which forces the moisture to a great altitude, no doubt produces a correspondingly heavy snowfall, and consequently low snow line. When the map of the Fox and Franz Josef glaciers is examined, it is not difficult to account for the low altitude to which these two glaciers descend. They have immense neve basins, and only a narrow outlet for the ice flow, which being forced out in considerable bulk down narrow and steep valleys, descends to a far lower altitude than those of the eastern side. The Franz Josef, for instance, descends over 8,000 feet in 8½ miles, a fall of more than 941 feet a mile on an average, and from the lower neve to the terminal face, the fall is still greater. For scientific men, there are several most interesting problems to solve, and a great deal remains to be done by geologists, botanists, and others. Up to the present, only those who do not mind roughing it considerably have gone far afield. It is true that the main glaciers on the eastern side have been thoroughly explored, and parties have for some years made annual expeditions to the Tasman district, climbing a few peaks and making a pass here and there. But even on the eastern side of the Southern Alps, especially north and south of the Tasman district, there is an immense amount of work to be done by alpine climbers. The details and general topography, however, of the eastern slopes of the central district are well known. On the western side, it is only during the last 3 years that the ranges in this locality have been explored and mapped, so far as minor detail and topography are concerned. The higher peaks, however, have for some years past been trigonometrically fixed by the Survey Department from the West Coast, a low country, and it has fallen to the lot of Mr. C.E. Douglas and myself to be the first to push up the rivers and glaciers and determine the details of the topography. Those districts, lying at the head of the Wataroa and Wanganui rivers on the west, and Rakaya and Rangitata on the east, have practically been left alone by alpine men, and, as already stated, The first two rivers named are almost wholly unknown in their upper valleys. In the south, there is work for years above the snow line on the virgin peaks of the Aspiring group, and also of the Hooker Range. And unless more parties take up this most fascinating of all sports, the completion of the work must be left to the next generation. All the larger glaciers, except those up the Rakaia River, have now been mapped and explored. I know from personal experience every one of importance in the central portion of the Southern Alps, with the exception of the Spencer up the Callery River. But many points of the greatest interest have still to be settled concerning their movement, advance or retreat, and also respecting the positions and effect of the large ancient glaciers on the formation of the ranges and valleys. End of preface and Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand by Arthur Paul Harper. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 2. The Tasman District. Tasman District. Mount Cook. First exploration of Murchison Glacier. First ascent of Harper Saddle. Other climbs. Necessary conditions. The only locality in the Southern Alps which has been in any way opened up for tourists is the Tasman or Mount Cook district, which includes the 4 large glaciers at the head of the Tasman River and nearly all the finest peaks in the Alps. The leading features of this district have already been so ably and thoroughly described by the Reverend W.S. Green, Dr. von Lindenfeld, and Mr. G.E. Mannering that I shall not dwell on the description of the scenery, but shall only give a short record of my own and others' work here, which has materially added to our topographical knowledge of the district since von Lindenfeld made his exploration of the Tasman Glacier. Note: The High Alps of New Zealand by Reverend W.S. Green, Macmillan. Der Tasman Gletscher und sein Ungeberg by von Lindenfeld. With Axe and Rope in the New Zealand Alps by G.E. Mannering, Longmans. The chief point of interest is Mount Cook, 12,349 feet. For some years past, an attempt has been made amongst those who climb in New Zealand to change the name of this peak to Aorangi, a Maori word. Some of those who write articles on their climbs are fond of saying Mount Cook, or to be correct, Aorangi, or some such expression, inferring that Mount Cook is not the correct name. I have always objected to the innovation, and have made inquiries in all directions, but can find no proof whatever that Aorangi was applied to the peak, or that it ever had a distinctive name amongst the Maoris. So far as I could learn from the Maoris of the west coast, who could see Mount Cook, and the other great peaks towering up within 20 miles, they had no name for any peak or range, except those lower hills on which they ventured. Again, the Maoris had a wholesome and deeply rooted fear of the mountains. None of the old West Coast natives ever went far from the low country, so it can hardly have been necessary for them to have individual names for the great snowy range. On the east coast, the Maoris could have had little knowledge of this district, as it is so far inland, and most of the South Island natives lived near the sea beach, from which Mount Cook is only in 1 or 2 places visible, and can only be distinguished by persons well acquainted with the peak. It therefore appears that if any Maori name existed, it would be known amongst the West Coast natives, who could see Mount Cook every clear day within 20 miles of the sea at the mouth of Cook or Weheka River, while those natives who lived on the Grey River and those settled at Jackson's Bay in the far south would be able to see it from nearly every part of the sea-coast, standing out in the most unmistakable manner. In 1865, I had a Maori, of whom more will be said, with me for 2 months, and a very good intelligent fellow he was. I asked him one day, "What does Aorangi mean, Bill?" To which he answered, "It means a big white cloud." I said, "I suppose that is why you call Mount Cook Aorangi?" "Oh no, Aorangi not mountain. Aorangi, a big white cloud. Here, there," said Bill, pointing out sundry large fleecy clouds. I then pressed him more on the point, and told him he knew nothing about it, and that Aorangi was the name they had for Mount Cook. But he waxed quite indignant, saying, "De Maori, he no name de mountains, only where he go, de white man he name 'em." I afterwards made inquiries from other Maoris, and always had the same reply, that they had no name for the high mountains. It is not a matter of much importance, but it will be a pity to have the older name of Mount Cook superseded by a Maori word which has only been applied to the peak during the present generation. The name Aorangi is no doubt a good one, and if it is considered advisable, there is no reason why it should not be adopted officially, but it is wrong to state that it is the proper name for the peak. Mount Cook is not on the main range, but lies on a ridge which branches off in a southerly direction from a point a little south of Mount Tasman, 11,475 feet. Note. See Appendix Note 2, end of note. This offshoot is about 12 miles long and includes some lower peaks of 6,000 and 7,000 feet, besides the 3 peaks of Mount Cook itself. On the western side, between it and the main chain, which here, after bending away to the west, turns again and runs parallel to Mount Cook for a short distance, the Hooker Glacier lies, and on the eastern side, the Great Tasman Glacier passes along the foot, receiving supplies from the peak. The Hooker Glacier gives rise to a river of the same name, which runs in a southeastern direction along the foot of the Mount Cook spur, to join the Tasman River some 4 or 5 miles below. A mile from the outflow of the glacier, the Hooker stream passes, sometimes along and sometimes under, the terminal face of the Muller Glacier, which winds in a northerly direction under Mount Sefton and the other peaks of the main range. Near the terminal face of the latter glacier, the Hermitage Hotel was built in 1885, and from it parties of climbers are able to make a comfortable start on numerous expeditions. To the north of Mount Tasman, the main range continues in a northeasterly direction to Mount Elie de Beaumont, 10,200 feet, a distance of 11 or 12 miles, after which it takes an abrupt turn to the east to the Hochstetter Dome, 9,258 feet, and thence again it gradually assumes a northeasterly direction past the Godley district to the head of the Rangitata, and so on. From a point a little east of the last named peak, the magnificent Malta-Brun range of rocky peaks branches off to the south, running nearly parallel to the main range and Mount Cook, and with them enclosing the Great Tasman Glacier, which takes its rise from the peaks of Elie de Beaumont and Hochstetter Dome. Still further eastwards, another and longer divergent ridge, the Liebig Range, branches from the main chain, running for a few miles in a due easterly direction, and then, sweeping sharply round, continues for 20 miles or more in a southwesterly direction. Between this range and the Malta-Brun, the Murchison Glacier flows, having a saddle at its head leading into the Tasman Glacier north of Mount Darwin, 9,715 feet, another saddle over the main range into the Whymper Glacier on the west coast, and a third in near proximity over the Liebig Range to the Classen Glacier, which lies at the head of the Godley River. The Murchison Glacier is the third in size of the New Zealand ice fields, and draws supplies chiefly from the Malta-Brun Range. Between the latter range and the main range, the Tasman Glacier, 18 miles in length, flows, receiving several large tributaries from the peaks of the Divide and Mount Cook. About 6 miles from the terminal face of the Tasman Glacier, at the inflow of the Ball Glacier, the government in 1891 built an iron hut, and formed a few tracks for the use of climbers, and from that date mountaineering may be said to have assumed a civilized form, for previously a start had to be made from the Hermitage Hotel, and camping necessaries had to be carried on our own shoulders over trackless moraines. Since the building of the hut, I have only been for 2 expeditions in this district, and, rough as the present arrangements are, as compared with Switzerland, they are luxurious when contrasted with our experience before 1891. Even now, in the Tasman, our best-known district, any expedition entails, for one not accustomed to it, a large amount of very hard work. We have no guides, and porters are difficult or almost impossible to get. The few men who have gone in for systematic work have had to learn the art of mountaineering without help, and necessarily at considerable risk. Consequently, we can boast of 3 or 4 climbers, who are almost first-class men, never having climbed with guides, and yet able to top some of our finest peaks. Alpine workers, especially in a new country like New Zealand, may be divided broadly into 2 classes, exploring climbers and climbers who wish only to top peaks. Of course, many do a little of both, but one class makes exploration its hobby, while the other cares for climbing only and is not particular about the topography or geography of the country, often adding very little to our knowledge of the mountains. Of the two classes, I think the explorer does the most useful work. True, he gets little credit for the hardships endured, because, after many weeks of hard work, he can often only prove which routes to avoid, and someone learning this important point appears on the scene with all his predecessor's knowledge, thus saving days of reconnoitring, and completes the climb or exploration. On his return, we hear the first man mentioned only as having failed at a certain place, or having made such and such mistakes, there being no acknowledgement of the benefit derived from those mistakes, or of the time saved by making use of his experiences. In another way, too, the first man has to take a second place. He may, in the course of his exploration, bring information as to a likely pass. The other makes the said pass, and writes a glowing account of, quote, "first pass by so-and-so," end quote, with no mention of the fact that Mr. Explorer gave him the whole facts as to the route. The result is that many who are better men with their pens than their axes gain great kudos, while the really hard worker who has borne the brunt of the battle is unknown except to a few, and has the misfortune of seeing the results of his work not only ignored, but, to a great extent, appropriated by someone else. In January 1890, Mr. G. E. Mannering and I made an expedition to this district, originally with the intention of trying Mount Cook. We formed our main camp on the site of Green's 5th Camp, which was close to the point at which the Bull Glacier joins the Tasman, some 6 miles above the terminal face. The above-mentioned hut now stands on this site and has a horse track to it. But in 1890, no sort of track existed, and we had to carry our heavy loads of from 30 to 50 pounds to the camp. The route, after reaching the terminal of the Tasman Glacier, had to be taken along the bottom of the V-shaped valley, formed on the left by the hillside, and on the right by the large lateral moraine of the glacier. In places, this valley is broken or half filled up by large shingle fans from the hill, and between these the bottom is filled with large boulders of 10 feet or so in diameter, which have fallen from the moraine or the hillside. Consequently, our progress was painfully slow, for we were always more or less in bad training at the commencement of our trip. I remember that I used to think at the time that there could not possibly be any worse ground to travel over, but my last 2 seasons' work on the West Coast rivers and glaciers have caused me to modify those ideals considerably. Yet from my knowledge of Switzerland, I can say without doubt that this district presents far greater difficulties on low ground than the former would present even before it had reached its present state of good tracks and huts. But as compared with some West Coast valleys, it is easy country to travel over. From our main camp, we established a bivouac on the Hochstetter Spur, near the one used by Mr. Green in 1882, and from there intended to establish another on the lower snows of the Linde Glacier, which flows down from the northern slopes of Cook, between it and Mount Tasman. The weather looked threatening, and I did not at all care to risk so high a sleeping place, but after some discussion we went on and reached the Glacier Dome, a rounded peak, over which the route lay to the Great Ice Plateau. While climbing the last rocks and pulling our loads up after us, one of the straps broke and the swag made a rapid descent for some 700 feet into a bergschrund. This put an end to the plan of sleeping out on the Linde Glacier. Therefore, after reaching the Great Ice Plateau, we made a return to the lower bivouac at 6,500 feet. The delay caused by the recovery of our lost load proved beneficial, for a howling northwest gale sprang up that night and made us most uncomfortable, but would have been almost fatal had it caught us at the proposed bivouac on the Linde Glacier, some 3,000 feet higher. At daylight next morning the gale was so bad that we continued the descent and retired to our main camp, having been so far successful that we could boast of being the first New Zealanders to reach the snow plateau and Glacier Dome. I had done a few climbs in Switzerland in 1887 and 1888, and had therefore some slight idea of the work of mountaineering, and was convinced that we had not yet had sufficient practice or experience to attempt such a difficult peak as Mount Cook. Consequently, Mannering, much against his wish, decided not to try the mountain again that year, unless we could make up a stronger party. This attempt was the only one I ever made on Mount Cook, but Mannering with Mr. H. Dixon again tried it the next season and nearly succeeded in conquering it by the same route as that taken by Mr. Green in 1882. Note, quote, with axe and rope in the New Zealand Alps, end quote, by Mr. G. E. Mannering, Longmans, end of note. Instead of returning to the Hermitage by the usual route, we made the first pass over the Cook Range via a saddle at the head of the Ball Glacier, 7,426 feet above sea level. It was an easy day's climb and led us into the Hooker Glacier about 5.5 miles above the Hermitage, and has since become quite a favorite expedition for tourists, giving, as it does, good snow and ice work, combined with glorious views of the 4 great glaciers and the chief peaks surrounding them. Having replenished our supplies, and being joined by Mr. H. M. Hamilton, a tourist whom we met at the hotel, we returned on the 9th January to our main camp. It was decided to give up the idea of climbing Cook, and to spend the remainder of our holiday in exploring the Murchison Valley, which joins the Tasman Valley just opposite our camp across the glacier. Though the terminal face of the Murchison Glacier has been seen for 4 miles distance from the lower portion of the Tasman Glacier, it had been up to that date entirely unexplored, and was supposed to take its rise from the southern slopes of Mount Darwin. We had no reason to suppose that this was not the case, but wished to make a personal exploration of the valley. Our plan was to proceed up the Murchison to the head and cross the Maltebrun Range between Mount Maltebrun, 10,421 feet, and Mount Darwin, 9,715 feet, by the saddle which was supposed to be the head of the glacier, and return down the Tasman to our camp. We expected to be able to do this in 1 day, but on second thoughts decided to take a blanket and a day's provisions. Starting on January 10th at 9 a.m. with light loads of about 30 pounds, and crossing the Tasman, a distance of 2.5 miles, in 2 hours we found ourselves in the riverbed of the Murchison, which, after the bad surface moraine of the Tasman, proved good travelling. Every step opened up new glaciers and peaks, and we wasted some valuable time in deciding whether these peaks were unnamed or only new views of old friends, with the result that it was 3:30 before we reached the glacier. The ice was covered with debris even worse than the Tasman Glacier. It is difficult to give an adequate idea of these terrible moraines. They must be seen by anyone wishing to realize their extent and size. Imagine loose boulders of all shapes and sizes, up to 10 or 15 feet square, thrown into heaps and hummocks 100 feet high, and in hopeless confusion, extending for miles, and a faint idea of what we had to travel over may be formed. With this sort of travelling, it may be supposed that progress was slow, and at 5 p.m. we had only gone a mile up the glacier. Here a tributary came in from the Maltebrun Range, near which was some scrub for firewood, so we took advantage of such a convenient spot and stopped for the night. So far nothing had happened to make us doubt that we should be able to cross the saddle at the head of the glacier and reach the Ball Glacier camp the next day. Therefore, we did not economize our food that evening or the next morning at our 5 a.m. breakfast. 2 miles above our camp, the glacier appeared to come from the left, off the Maltebrun Range, but on reaching the spot and ascending a rise in the ice, we discovered that it was only a tributary stream, and the main glacier lay in front of us, stretching out for miles, and evidently coming from the northern side of Darwin instead of the southern slopes. A short council of war as to the advisability of continuing an expedition which must involve another night and day away from camp, with only enough food for 1 meal left, ended in our deciding to do or die. Consequently, we made for the white ice now just ahead of us, and began to move more easily and quickly. At 1:30 p.m. we saw to our joy a saddle of some 7,400 feet on our left front, which appeared to lead over the Maltebrun Range to the Tasman Glacier, at the head of a large tributary, the main glacier apparently coming from a saddle a mile or 2 further to the north. After some rather difficult work amongst snow-covered crevasses, and in a thick mist, we arrived on our saddle at 4:30 p.m. In a short time the fog lifted, and we were fairly puzzled to know where we had got to. No Tasman was in sight, but far below us an unknown glacier swept away to our right hand instead of to our left, as we had anticipated. Suddenly Mannering saw the Hochstetter Dome, which he had ascended the previous season, and then it all became evident. Instead of being on a pass over the Maltebrunn Range, we had ascended a spur round which the Murchison Glacier came, and the ice below us was the head of that glacier, sweeping down to the right, previous to turning at right angles round the spur on which we were. Some distance to our left we could see a saddle leading into the Tasman hopelessly out of our reach, and in front, across the head of the Murchison, another saddle over the main range, evidently leading into the Whymper Glacier, which lies at the head of a branch of the Wataroa River on the west coast. Our pass, therefore, only led us into the neve of the glacier on which we had been for the last 2 days. Hamilton was somewhat out of training and wanted a rest badly, so we took an hour's spell and made a rough map. Sometime after 5:30 p.m. we began to retrace our steps, having left a record of the ascent of Starvation Saddle in a cairn. At 8 p.m. we found a fair bivouac, and supperless rolled ourselves in our blankets, and were soon in the land of Nod. At daybreak, after a miserably small meal, which exhausted our supplies, we moved off, and in 8 hours reached the head camp, I having gone ahead to cook a meal for the others, who arrived an hour later. The result of this expedition was topographically important. It proved that the Murchison was a large glacier, as far as was then known, the second in size in New Zealand. Also, that instead of coming from Darwin's southern slopes, it came from the main range at a point 2 miles north of that peak, which is, as I have already explained, on the Maltebrunn Range, an offshoot of the divide. Therefore, the Murchison with the Tasman encloses the Maltebrunn Range like a great island in a sea of ice. The government had this glacier surveyed during the next season and proved our topographical conclusions to be correct, and also showed that our sketch map was practically right in all its features. In the early part of the next season, December 1890, I formed a party consisting of Messrs. R. Blackiston, W. Beadle, and myself. But owing to some terribly bad weather and heavy snow, we did nothing till January, except twice reach the Ball Glacier, and on each occasion being driven back by terrific storms. The season was notable for 1 or 2 things only, but all of them important. In that year, Mr. Broderick, government surveyor, completed the survey of the district, and Mannering nearly succeeded in ascending Mount Cook, in company with Mr. Dixon, a most plucky attempt. And lastly, R. Blackiston and I made the first complete traverse of the Hooker Glacier and ascent of the saddle at its head, since called Harper Saddle, 8,580 feet. The upper basin of this glacier had never been visited, though 2 or 3 attempts had been made to reach it, rendered unsuccessful by the enormous crevasses about 5 miles up the glacier. The previous 3 weeks' bad weather and heavy snow, however, had so covered the ice that I decided to make the ascent. On December 29th, Blackiston and I left the Hermitage with a light camp, which we pitched some 2 miles above the terminal face on the western side of the glacier. On the morning of the 30th, an unfortunately late start was made at 6:30, and after an hour or so on the lateral moraine, we took to the snow-covered ice, which rose in a succession of ice falls on which the snow was disagreeably soft. Thanks to the heavy fall, we were able to cross all the broken ice, but not without considerable care, as some of the crevasses were of great width. 8 hours floundering above our knees in soft snow brought us to the foot of the saddle, which lay at the top of an ice wall of 250 feet, rising very steeply to within 60 feet of the top. A large bergschrund skirted the foot of this ice slope, and delayed us a good deal, as it was not easily negotiated. I took the lead, for Blackiston was new to ice work, and after cutting some 120 steps, we stood on the saddle. I have never experienced in any other climb such difficulty in the way of step cutting. For the first 180 feet, the slope was so steep that I had to lean my chest against the ice while cutting the next steps, and could see Blackiston below me by looking between my feet. In New Zealand, there is the same trouble with fog as in Switzerland. That is to say, it is very rare that a clear view can be obtained over the west coast after 10 a.m. because a low dense bank of fog drifts in from the sea and fills the valleys, only allowing of 6,000 feet and upwards to be seen. This is, I imagine, very much like the fog so often seen on the Italian side of the Alps. The saddle led into the La Perouse Glacier at the head of the Cook River on the west coast, but we could see nothing of the valley owing to the fog, which lay 500 feet or so below us, and which, though we tried to descend, prevented our completing a transalpine pass. The day had been intensely hot, which made it highly probable that several snow bridges would be gone and new crevasses exposed, hence it was necessary to waste as little time as possible and to reach them before dusk. At 3:30, after leaving a record of the ascent, we began to descend, Blackiston going first, and both descending backwards. The steadiness of my companion on this ice slope is beyond praise, considering that this was his first expedition on ice or snow. Unfortunately also it was his last, for he has never been free to climb since, and we have lost a promising mountaineer. Opposite Baker's Saddle, which lies south of Mount Stokes and leads into the Copeland River on the west coast, we found the crevasses very much exposed and bridges gone. No less than 10 had appeared, which were invisible in the morning. One crevasse we crossed on the snow by crawling was of great breadth. I believe it was fully 25 feet wide. So large and numerous are these that, except early in the season, I feel convinced a route up the Hooker would be a most difficult thing to find. At 7 p.m. we regained our camp, and next day, in heavy rain, retraced our steps to the hotel, fearfully burnt and sore from the glare on the fresh snow. This climb was topographically of importance, and had we had a clear view over the west coast, we could have answered some interesting questions, which, however, I was able to decide 2 or 3 years later, as will be seen in a future chapter. The actual result was that the map of the Hooker was proved incorrect as regards the head basin and the position of Mount Cook, which had been placed on the main range. As a matter of fact, it is on the eastern side and sends no drainage onto the west coast at all. Mount Cook branches off at Mount Dampier, 11,323 feet, which drops on one side into the Linda Glacier, on another into the head basin of the Hooker, while its third side falls precipitously into the La Perouse Glacier on the west coast. From Dampier, the main range goes to Mount Hicks, or St. David's Dome, 10,410 feet, and thence past Harper's Saddle, 8,580 feet, to Stokes, 10,101 feet, whence it bends away sharply southwards to Sefton, 10,359 feet, and Mount Burns, 8,984 feet, which lies at the head of the Muller Glacier. Though our climb finally settled the position of Mount Cook as being off the main range, it is only fair to say that Mr. Roberts of the Westland Survey Department had practically decided the point and only wanted to have it confirmed by more sure evidence. When sitting on the saddle, I planned a route up Mount Cook, which seemed to be far easier and more direct than that followed by Mr. Green, but unfortunately I never had an opportunity of attempting it. However, Mr. Fife, who also considered it the best route, followed it when he made the first ascent of the peak on Christmas Day, 1894. Later on in the same season, namely February 1891, Mr. P.H. Johnson and I made another expedition to this district, intending to climb de la Beche, 9,815 feet, and the Minarets, 10,058 feet, part of the same mountain. Unfortunately, my companion fell ill, and we did nothing for a week or more, and then only made 2 small climbs, namely, a pass over the Maltebrun Range, the first climb done on that range, and an attempt at Mount Seeley, from which we were driven by a terrific northwest gale when near the top. The following summer I made 3 attempts at Mount de la Beche, but had the most extraordinary bad luck. The first attempt was in company with M.H. Hamilton, and we reached a point close under the main peak, some 9,000 feet above sea level, when my companion became helpless owing to sickness. I then returned and obtained Jack Adamson from the Hermitage, and with him reached the same point in such a gale of wind that we could not stand. And 2 days later we again went for the peak, when my mate was seized with a cramp in the stomach, which forced us to return at 8 a.m. within 900 feet of the summit. The only fact worth recording with regard to these climbs is that I obtained the first photographs ever taken overlooking the main range. I have the somewhat melancholy satisfaction of knowing that my route, which lay up the Rudolph Glacier and up the rock face of the peak, was the correct one. Fyfe, who made the first ascent of this mountain later, wrote and told me he had followed my route, and it presented no real difficulty. Mount de la Beche is one of our most beautiful peaks, and stands between the Tasman Glacier and the Kronprinz Rudolf Glacier, a large tributary flowing into the main glacier some 12 miles up. At the point where these two ice streams join, a deep, triangular hollow is found, bounded on two sides by the high lateral moraines of the two glaciers, and on the third by de la Beche. This area is filled with large masses of rock, and under one Adamson and I built a first-rate shelter, which is really as good as a hut, forming a convenient point from which to ascend 15 or 20 of our highest peaks. For a really successful expedition in this district, a party should be composed of 4 men who are willing to do a considerable amount of rough work and ready to carry their own loads. They must also have plenty of time at their command, as nearly all our old failures are due to want of time, which prevented our waiting for good opportunities, and compelled us to attempt all sorts of difficult expeditions in the face of doubtful weather. There are only 2 parties who have done any extended work in this district in one season, and both owe their success to having plenty of time at their disposal. Those of us who used to try and climb with only a short holiday always prophesied success to the first man who could spend a month or 2 at the Hermitage, and that prophecy turned out to be true. In 1893-1894 season, Fyfe spent a considerable time in the district, and could afford to wait for his weather. Consequently, he made the first ascents of 3 or 4 of our best peaks. Again, in 1894-1895 season, Mr. Fitzgerald, with his Swiss guide Zurbriggen, had a successful season, making several ascents, and owing his success as much to the fact that he could await fine weather and good opportunities as to the fact that he had Zurbriggen to guide him. Fyfe's climbs were of course guideless, and considering that he is, like all of us, a self-taught man, they are greatly to his credit. In fact, so far as peaks are concerned, his record exceeds that of anyone who has climbed in New Zealand for bona fide merit. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand by Arthur Paul Harper. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 3 Westland. The west coast of New Zealand, the forest and its plants, birds. In August 1893, I applied to and obtained work from the Westland Survey Department, in conjunction with Mr. C.E. Douglas, to continue the exploration and mapping of the rivers and glaciers with their surrounding ranges. Mr. Douglas had been working for some 20 years, following and traversing rivers to their sources, but none of the larger glaciers had been explored, except the moraine-covered Strauchan on the Copeland River and Balfour Glacier on the central branch of Cook River. This was owing to the want of a man experienced in ice work, Douglas having, as a rule, only carried his work to the snow line, and having neither companion nor alpine equipment, was unable to go into high altitudes. Before relating my own experiences amongst the Westland glaciers and Alps, it will be as well to give a short description of the country. This will allow my readers to form some idea of the conditions under which our work had to be carried on. Westland, or West Coast, as it is more commonly called, was rushed by gold diggers in the early 60s, and a large amount of gold was found and exported. Now, however, it has become, from a digging point of view, a field of far less importance. True, there are still many working the alluvial ground, but those making more than Tucker are few, and it is many years since a rise of importance has been made by anyone. The country itself, except for a few clearings made by settlers, may be said to be covered with dense evergreen bush, forest, up to 3,000 feet above sea level, which gradually merges into a low, impenetrable scrub growing perhaps 500 feet higher, until it gives way to luxuriant snowgrass and other alpine plants. There is a narrow strip of more or less flat country, that is, rough, low hills, with patches of actually flat land between the ranges and the sea, varying from 25 to 5 miles in width. It is of little value from an agricultural or pastoral point of view, covered as it is with bush, forest, and costing more than its value to clear. Here and there are large tracts of swampy ground, useless to man or beast at present, but which may prove valuable if properly drained. These large swamps are usually to be found between the rivers on the flat country, and with few exceptions confine the settlers to the river flats near the sea, where the best land is to be found. To a casual visitor, there would seem to be in Westland an inexhaustible amount of marketable timber, both on the flat country and in the ranges. The truth is, however, that beyond a certain amount on the low country, there is very little. In the ranges and up the rivers, there is practically none of value, and those trees which are worth cutting are so scattered that they would be unworkable by any mill fixed in one locality. It is doubtful if the timber up the rivers will be more than sufficient to build and keep in repair culverts and bridges, when such are constructed. On the Arawata and Blue rivers, in the far south of the country, there is a very fine patch of birch, really a beech, bush, which could be worked with advantage from one centre. Douglas speaks of trees 42 feet in circumference, with a clean trunk of 90 feet to the lowest limb, growing on the Arawata. At present, however, the means of communication with the rest of the colony are very poor, a fact which adds greatly to the difficulty of making either farming or any other industry remunerative. The gold industry is the mainstay of the southern part of Westland, and there is little doubt that, should the output of the precious metal cease, there would be small inducement for a population to stay in the district. A few, possibly, who prefer a free and unfettered existence in a part of the colony where they can easily make a small living, may consent to dwell in such an out-of-the-way locality. It is, however, more than probable that the minerals of Westland will continue to give employment to some number, especially when better means of communication are provided, which will allow them to be worked at less cost with more chance of profit. The only connection with the rest of the colony is by steamer and coach, while south of Ross the communication is precarious, to say the least, only a pack-horse mail running at present. In my opinion, Westland has a great future before it, if properly and energetically pushed as a tourist resort. Nowhere else in New Zealand is there such magnificent scenery, equalling, if not surpassing, that of Switzerland and Norway in grandeur. But it is out of reach of the ordinary tourist, unless he is willing to rough it considerably, while to see the finest views in the Southern Alps on this side, days and weeks of hardship must be faced, which would frighten most people. Before any noticeable benefit can be felt from tourists, some steps must be taken to make means of transit easier. At present, owing to the unbridged state of the rivers and frequent rain, there is great risk of loss of time by being stuck up by floods. But until we have a large neighbouring population, a government would hardly be justified in going to great expense in making roads and bridges. The bush. Note: in New Zealand, the forest is always spoken of as bush, as opposed to lower growth vegetation, which is called scrub. End of note. Or forest of New Zealand has often been described, but even had nothing been said on the subject, it would require a more gifted pen than mine to depict its beauties. The fascination which it has over all those who see or work in it cannot be understood by one who has not experienced it. I will not attempt to describe the innumerable beautiful ferns and mosses, and the wonderful colouring of the bush, which never cease to exercise their power over even the oldest hand, if he has any love of fine effects. When toiling through dense undergrowth, cutting a track, or carrying a heavy load, I found time to enjoy the lovely effects and fairy-like scenes met with at every turn. Yet, in spite of its many attractions, it is a serious drawback to such work as ours, or in fact, to any which entails much travelling. Even the oldest bushman may find himself temporarily bushed, but a good man can, by use of common sense and coolness, generally find his way out somewhere, not necessarily at the place he wants to go to, but at least to some locality from which he can easily reach habitation. Common sense is not, unfortunately, a strong point with some, if we may judge by the frequent absurd actions of persons lost in the bush. For half the year it is easy to build a shelter with bark, and at all times with ferns, while no one need be without a good fire unless, of course, he has no matches. those who have in the past suffered from exposure have done so for want of a little thought. But many, when bushed, seem to lose their reasoning powers, for there are cases in which it has not occurred to men in such a plight to kindle a fire, even though they have a plentiful supply of matches, nor to try and snare a bird, or eat some of the edible plants in the bush, when suffering from hunger. When, however, we hear that there have been men who, on being lost in hilly country covered with timber, have, on reaching a river, actually gone upstream in order to get into the low country, it is hardly surprising that the misfortune of being bushed is often serious in its effects. Though there are several edible plants, they are not very nourishing, nor can I honestly say very nice. However, a hungry man must eat what he can get, and I have often been glad of even a small feed of pica fern, Asplenium bulbiferum. This is perhaps the best of our natural foods, and the curled, crozier-like shoot is quite passable when boiled for an hour. In addition to this is the head of the young supplejack, Parsomsia albiflora, a vine which grows in immense quantities up to nearly 2,000 feet above sea level, and is about as bad an obstacle to force a way through as I know. The kihiki, Freycinetia banksii, which grows on the lower hills near the sea, wild parsley, Angelica geniculata, spinach, Tetragonia expansa, and root of the bracken fern, Terra sesculenta, are also eatable. In the low country, that is, below 1,200 or 2,000 feet, the undergrowth in the bush is bad beyond descriptions, especially where supplejacks and lawyers, Rubus australis, abound. For the benefit of those who have never been in New Zealand, it may be explained that a lawyer is a bramble which grows in very dense masses and is covered with small thorns. It is so named because, when once a man is unfortunate enough to get into its clutches, he finds it hard to free himself. These most obstructive plants are fortunately not found above 1,500 feet from sea level, unless the hill has sea frontage. Besides the plants already mentioned as eatable, there are others possessing valuable medicinal qualities. The best known of these is perhaps the coromico, a shrub belonging to the Veronica tribe, which makes a good tonic, useful in cases of dysentery, and has already been used to make a patent medicine. A certain portion of the flax plant, Phormium tenax, has an effect opposite to the coromico. For external use we have the gum of the miro pine, Podocarpus ferruginea, the finest healing ointment for an open wound that I have ever used, and a sure cure for warts. The Maoris often take the leaf of the pepper tree, Drimus axillaris, and after chewing it apply it to a wound, which it is said to heal very soon, leaving a blue tattoo mark. The leaf, I think, is more or less poisonous and should be avoided, like all those shrubs which have leaves with white undersides and dark above. For camping purposes, it would be difficult indeed to surpass the New Zealand forest, and in the mountain ranges of the west coast, though we grumble at the work it involves, we really have great cause to be thankful for it. The eastern slopes of the Southern Alps are open and grass-covered, a great contrast to the densely timbered ranges of the west coast. In the one district, the want of firewood for camping purposes is felt, and in the other too much timber gives a party a great deal of heavy work when traveling. If it were possible to split the difference, each side would be all that could be desired for explorations, easy traveling combined with good camping grounds. Between October and March in the mountains, within 3,000 feet of sea level, it is really not necessary to carry canvas unless, of course, one is fastidious as to shelter. It is always possible to build a good whare or maimai, with bark stripped from the rata, Metrosideros robusta, totara, Podocarpus totara, or cedar, Libocedrus bidwillii trees, all or some of which are to be found up the rivers. Of firewood, there is such an inexhaustible supply and good variety to select from, that it is always possible to keep a fire burning without any necessity to economize, a great consideration in wet weather. There is the rata tree, the prince of firewoods, very hard, and burning almost like coal, dry or green. Miki, aki, kamahi, or so-called red birch, white and black birches, which are really beeches, the mountain broom, ribbonwood, broadleaf, totara, and many others, all burning in a green state, though the first 6 or 7 are the best, and always available in the ranges. While enumerating thus shortly the advantages and disadvantages of the bush, I cannot pass over one of the greatest charms of camp life and work in unexplored country, namely, the birds, to whom man is a stranger. They are not only useful as food, and enable 2 of us to do work which really required 4 men, but they provide us with endless amusement when together, and are especially welcome when one is working or camping alone. First and foremost of these is the weka, Osidromus australis, wood hen or Maori hen, as he is variously called, as good a camp companion as one could wish for, with his tameness, impudence, and almost human power of expression. I have never studied a weka in or near civilization, but as found in the hitherto unvisited valleys, in which my last 2 years have chiefly been spent, he is only approached by the kia, or mountain parrot, as a source of amusement and interest. Often Douglas and I have sighed for the powers of the artist whose Zigzags at the Zoo in the Strand magazine helped many a wet day to pass, wherewith to depict the many knowing expressions of the weka and kia. Perhaps it is almost unnecessary to say that the weka is a bird with small, unformed wings, unable to fly, and varying in size from a partridge to a pheasant. In plumage he is not unlike the former, sometimes dark brown, and sometimes a very light colour, according to whether his habitation is in narrow and gloomy valleys or open grass country. He walks with a very genteel step, and bobs his short tail up spasmodically, his whole action suggesting the exaggerated motions of a teacher of deportment, if such a person exists outside novels. The male and female only keep together during the breeding season, and if the place they choose for their temporary abode happens to be productive of the necessaries of weka life, the cock drives his mate and family away at the end of the season, remaining in solitary possession of a good feeding ground. Should, however, the locality be indifferently productive, Mr. Weka bids the family a glad farewell on completion of his domestic duties, and seeks happier hunting grounds for himself. As to food, he is omnivorous, eating everything from a pea rifle cartridge to the remains of one of his own tribe, or even family. I remember an instance of this when our dog unfortunately killed a young bird before we could prevent it, which was too small to eat. The parents made a decent show of grief over their loss, and then, being quite sure that the little one was dead, they proceeded to eat its still warm remains. In camp, the birds are useful as scavengers, but they are incorrigible thieves, trying to take away everything at all white or glittering. And as they are able to move a weight of 2 or 3 pounds, it can well be imagined that a careful lookout has to be kept. The glance of mingled triumph and contempt which a weka gives over his shoulder as he walks off with your pipe is inimitable, and his whole attitude would make a most laughable picture if well drawn. One of these birds will take full possession of a camp as soon as he discovers it, generally within a few hours of its being pitched, and rarely have we been without one or a pair. No other birds or rats are allowed to come near if he can help it, but are attacked without hesitation. And if another weka dares to intrude, the one in possession will, 9 times out of 10, manage to make good his claim, though sometimes the combatants seem very unevenly matched for a fight. Possession is 9 points of the law. They even rush wildly at a thrush or crow, though far out of reach above them, and often resort to stratagem to induce the object of their attack to come within reach. I have seen a weka run under a shrub on which a thrush was sitting and try to frighten him. This had no effect, so our friend walked away out of sight, and in a few minutes returned, and when he had come under the thrush, he suddenly tumbled down, and with stiffened limbs and ruffled feathers, feigned to be dead. It was a fine piece of acting, but he had one wicked little eye open. The thrush looked at the motionless weka for a second or 2, and then began to sing, as much as to say, "I've played this game before," leaving our friend to get up and try not to look foolish. The thrush never seems to fall into the trap. The weka, though very clever in carrying out his scheme, sometimes tries it on 2 or 3 times in succession, which shows some want of intelligence. For downright impudence, too, the weka is unequalled, and no doubt this fact will help to preserve him against his new foe, the weasel, so kindly turned loose by a paternal, or shall I say maternal, government. Though really no match for such an antagonist, he will by mere bluff frighten it, for if he sees the weasel first, he will charge it, though I fear if vice versa, he will run away. The weka will figure often in these pages, so for the present we will leave him. The robin, Miro albifrons, is a constant companion in some localities, as far as the bush limit. He differs from his English namesake very little, only having a yellow instead of a red breast. They are quite tame and generally called dear gentle little things, but in reality they are the most vicious and quarrelsome little birds it is possible to imagine. A family of 4 or 5 seem to spend their whole time in fighting, a great contrast to the weka family. When one is cutting or climbing through the bush, a robin nearly always follows close behind, picking up grubs exposed in the footsteps and depositing them under moss or in holes in a tree for future use. Of songbirds we find a great number in the back country, away from the haunts of men, notably the crow, Glaucopus cinerea, which has a note like a rich-toned flageolet, the most beautiful bird I have heard in our ranges. Besides him are the bellbirds, mentioned by Captain Cook, and getting very scarce. The tui, canary, and many others, all of which swell the chorus, heard every morning and evening. The canaries, Orthonyx or Chrysocephala, and the little mountain wrens, Xenacus filviventris, are useful as foretellers of weather, for they always collect in flocks and keep up a lively chirping some hours before an approaching storm, a warning which we never allow to pass unnoticed. For the camp pot there is a varied choice. The weka is perhaps the most nourishing, having a large amount of oil when in good condition. Over 1/4 of a pint can be obtained from a fat bird, which, though not very palatable, is sustaining and can be baked with flour to advantage. The kiwi is passable when one is hungry, though personally I do not like him, but being more nutritious than savory, it is not to be despised, and is almost nice when boiled with piki fern and rice. The kiwi is a wingless bird, and still fairly plentiful in out-of-the-way places, but on the whole is fast becoming extinct. The west coast kiwi, Apteryx oweni, is a small grey bird, differing from the North Island species, Apteryx mantelli, which is dark brown and more coarsely made. With the help of a good dog, they can generally be caught asleep in the daytime, being entirely night birds. Sometimes in the spring 1 or generally 2 eggs are to be found with a pair in their retreat, but chiefly owing to cats and weasels, there are more solitary birds than originally. The only way to account for this is that, owing to the unknown enemy which has appeared, they become frightened and are unwilling to pair. To quote Mr. Douglas, Mrs. Kiwi probably says, "What is the good of my laying that awful egg if a weasel sucks it while we are actually sitting on it?" The size of the egg is well known, and it is hard to believe that so small a bird can lay one so large. However, not 1 but generally 2 are produced. Both birds sit to hatch this, which is nearly as large as a black swan's egg. Note. See Appendix. Note 3. End of note. For one could not possibly cover it alone, and there is little doubt that the warmth of decayed vegetable matter contributes largely to the hatching. Though laying 2 eggs, they only hatch 1, and I have heard it suggested that the second is laid later and used to feed the young one, for though there is only 1 young bird, there are generally the remains of 2 eggs, and 2 are frequently found before hatching. During the daytime they sleep in a standing position, with their heads tucked down between their legs, looking like a fluffy ball on 2 sticks. When taking a kiwi from its hole, great care must be observed if the skin is required for stuffing, for while the body is warm the feathers or hair fall out in handsful wherever they are touched, but after it is cold it is the hardest bird to pluck I know. The kaka, Nestor meridionalis, kakapo, Stringops habruptilis, and kia, Nestor notabilis, of the parrot tribe, the wood pigeon, blue, grey, and paradise ducks, are all excellent for eating, and if one is hard pushed for food, the smaller birds such as the crow, tui, parakeet, and saddlebacks are all acceptable. The kakapo is found in southwestland, the Sounds country of Otago, and the Nelson province. He is rarely, if ever, seen away from the birch forests. He is a large ground parrot with a bright green plumage, and, except for descending from a rock or bluff 30 feet in height, his wings are useless to him. Like the kiwi, he is a night bird, living in holes and under rocks all day. As food, he comes second only to the weka, having a large quantity of fine oil in his body, of a light straw color. We capture him with the help of our dog, and he shows a great deal of fight before he surrenders. This bird apparently performs an operation on his food, akin to chewing the cud, that is, He collects a large amount of grass in his crop and retires to his refuge to chew it. And when all the juice has been extracted, he throws the grass out in dry bowls. After feeding, these birds make a booming noise, not unlike the grunt of a pig, and though it can be heard for a great distance, it is quite impossible to locate it. Probably the fact of the bird being in a hole will account for the deceptive nature of the sound. I have heard the noise apparently within a few yards of me, and have been surprised and angry at the dog not looking for the bird where I pointed, but instead of doing so, he has run off up the hillside for some considerable distance, and in a few moments the shrieking of the bird and barking of the dog will show that the noise had deceived me completely. The crop of a kakapo, when freshly killed, makes a capital poultice if applied to a sore, drawing out all poisonous matter quickly and effectually, so the Maoris say. Though one of our largest birds, it has an egg not much bigger than of a pigeon, a great contrast to the enormous egg produced by such a small bird as the grey kiwi. It would be both reasonable and convenient, I should imagine, if they could change eggs. Blue or mountain ducks, Nestor rotabilis, are not now found in any numbers except in the upper parts of hitherto unvisited rivers, and make a very welcome addition to our supplies, which are generally at a somewhat low ebb by the time we reach the head of a river. They appear to have the rivers and creeks marked off in regular divisions, never encroaching on the preserves of another, or allowing intrusion by a strange couple. I have seen many instances of this rule of division, and proved it by driving 2 or 3 pairs downstream with their broods, and finding them all in their own claims next morning. Many a fight can be seen between 2 pairs when a strange couple try to jump a claim. Their chief weapon of attack is a horny growth on the second joint of the wing. Unlike most New Zealand birds, the male and female are partners all the year round, but the female alone sits on the eggs while the male keeps guard and feeds her. The paradise duck, Casarca variegata, is too much like a tough goose in my opinion, but the flappers, or young ones, are very good indeed when roasted. Here, again, we find a peculiarity. These ducks will sometimes build their nest in a tree 30 feet from the ground, but by what means they bring their young ones to terra firma or water, I cannot say. Possibly they carry them on their backs, but if they followed the usual happy-go-lucky laws of nature in New Zealand, it is as likely as not that the promising brood is allowed to tumble out one by one and trust to Providence. Scientific descriptions and names of our birds can be found in Sir Walter Buller's Birds of New Zealand. The above short description is not intended, by any means, to be complete, for that would be unnecessary. But certain interesting habits of the birds can be noted by those who see them in their undisturbed and natural haunts, which scientists may not have been able to obtain, having had few opportunities to go far from civilization. It is a sad fact that most of the native birds of the country are gradually disappearing. In the early days, those who went into unknown country found thousands of birds of all kinds, but now, even in localities hitherto unvisited by man, birds are scarce. Sometimes, of course, they are as numerous as formerly, but I have been into valleys where hardly a bird was to be seen of any kind. This is largely due to cats and weasels. The digger is very fond of his cat, and nearly always carries one with him. But in the past, when new rushes were frequent, he would go off at a moment's notice from his camp or hut, and if the cat was not at hand, it was left behind, and naturally became wild. These have increased and multiplied enormously, and I have seen their tracks miles up unexplored valleys. It has been several years since the coast was overrun by wild cats, and now weasels are added to the list of enemies which the birds have to contend against. It is therefore only a question of time before our most interesting birds, those that cannot fly, become extinct. The government has widely set apart 2 large islands on which to preserve birds and plants, and they seem to be answering their purpose. These are Little Barrier Island in the north near Auckland, and Resolution Island near the Sounds in the southwest. No doubt, in the unexplored country behind the Sounds, there are still plenty of birds, but there again it is only a matter of time before they are exterminated. Though there are wild dogs escaped from civilization, they are in no great numbers, as a wild life does not seem to suit them, and they soon die out. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand by Arthur Paul Harper. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 4. The Waiho River, Franz Joseph Glacier. Journey southwards. Waiho River, Lake Maporika. Terminal face. Camp 1. Attempts on glacier. Hot springs. Camp 2. Camp 3. Icefall. Baffled. Return. On the 6th October 1893, Mr. C.E. Douglas and I left Hokitika with instructions to map Lake Ianthe, some 40 miles south along the road, and thence traverse the Wanganui River to the sea from the ferry on the road, after which we had to make our way further south to the Waiho River and explore the Franz Joseph Glacier. A daily coach runs to Ross, a small mining township of 500 inhabitants, 20 miles from Hokitika, and thence there is a weekly pack-horse mail service to Gillespie's Beach, 88 miles south of Ross, and near the mouth of Cook River. We therefore put our small supply of clothing on the coach as far as Ross, and here obtained 3 weeks' stores and a pack-horse to carry them to Lake Ianthe. It took us to the 20th to finish our work on the lake, and on the 22nd we started in a small dugout, or canoe, hollowed out of a tree down the outlet which flowed into the Wanganui River, and on the 24th went down the river to the sea, having some very narrow escapes in the foaming rapids. Our craft was only 6 feet by 2 feet, and very clumsily made, so we had a good deal to be thankful for in getting down safely. It was largely due to luck, helped by Douglas's steering. Next day we returned on foot to our camp, some 7 miles up the river, and thence carried our impedimenta 5 miles on to Hendy's Ferry, which is on the main south track, 30 miles south of Ross. This road, after leaving Ross, skirts along the foot of the hills and crosses the Wanganui at Hendy's Ferry, 30 miles, the Wataroa River at Gunn's Ferry, 50 miles, branches off to Lake Maporika on the left hand and Okarito, 64 miles from Ross, on the right-hand side. From the latter place, which lies on the sea beach, the road is non-existent, and it is just possible to take a wheeled vehicle to that point, the journey occupying about 3 days from Hokitika. From Hendy's Ferry, where we slept, we carried our loads and tramped to Gunn's on the Wataroa, and on the 20th of October went on to the Miners' Rest at the Forks, a settlement at the point where the road branches. The Forks is a township which can boast of a public house and 1 digger's hut, though in old days it had a large population when plenty of gold was being obtained there. Now, however, only 2 or 3 parties are working near it, and, on mail night especially, the whole neighbouring population, of perhaps 10, assemble at the Miners' Rest. I am sorry to say they do not confine themselves to tea. On these occasions politics form the chief topic of conversation, because numbers of diggers, having Hansard's parliamentary reports sent to them gratis, and religiously reading every word, are keen politicians. I cannot conceive anyone wading through these reports, for when it is remembered that there are some members in the House who speak for no other reason than to see themselves, or for their constituents to see them, in Hansard, it can be imagined what sort of reading they afford. One evening, when we were waiting for pack-horses to take our stores as far as possible up the Waiho River, I became involved in a political discussion. One of the diggers charged me with being a capitalist. "How can I be a capitalist when I've no money?" I answered. "Money," he explained, "has nothing to do with it." I remonstrated. He said, "Well, I don't know about your money, but you speak like a capitalist." I again objected that I could hardly be called a capitalist if I had no capital. So he changed his ground and said, "Well, you're a conservative anyway." Being of opinion that there were no conservatives in this colony, and objecting to the expression, I thought this a good opportunity to find out what politicians meant by it. So I replied, "Ah, yes, I may be a conservative, but you must tell me what a conservative is before I can answer." "A conservative," he said hesitatingly, is a man you don't agree with." I always suspected this to be the truth of the matter, for each party generally dubs itself the Great Liberal Party, which I suppose implies that the other side are conservatives. On the 31st we obtained 2 horses, and went on towards Franz Joseph Glacier. About 3 miles from the Forks is Maporika Township, which consists of a store and a public house, with a small population of 10 or 20 diggers. Here we procured our necessaries. A horse can be taken right up to the terminal face of the glacier, so there was no need to procure all our stores at once. We therefore only ordered enough for a month or 6 weeks, for we might perhaps finish our work in that time, if favoured with fine weather, and if not, could easily have more sent up. After leaving the township, the road, or horse track, skirts the beautiful Maporika Lake, and many lovely views are to be seen through openings in the bush. To see this lake to advantage, it is necessary to stay a day or two at the township, and hire a boat. I camped on a promontory halfway up the lake for a week in January 1894, when surveying it, at the time of the full moon, and the views day and night were glorious. At the southern end, the snowy peaks of the Bismarck Range tower into the sky, with Mounts Cook and Tasman just appearing over them. And at a distance of 9 miles, the Franz Josef Glacier is seen coming out of the valley, between bush-clad hills, and apparently pushing its way into the bush at the head of the lake. In the foreground are numerous promontories, with great trees overhanging and reflecting in the perfectly still water, or perhaps the limb of some fallen giant stands naked out of the placid surface of the lake. After my day's work, I used to get into my boat and drift about on the lake, smoking the pipe of contentment, and watching the last rays of the sun throwing a pink glow over the great snow peaks, and the gloom gradually deepening over the glacier and lower valleys. Then the moon would rise and shed its white light over the whole scene, and make me loth to return to my camp in the bush, with its mosquitoes. About 8 miles from Maporika Township, after leaving the lake, the track passes a farm on the river flats of the Totra and Waiho rivers, on which sheep and cattle are grazed, and which is one of the few farms in the south where more than a living can be made. This is chiefly owing to the fairly large number of diggers in the district. The homestead is only a small house, but it is surrounded by a few acres of cleared land laid down in grass, and forms a pleasing contrast to the sombre-coloured bush and hills behind. Crossing the Totra River, the track continues for 2 miles to the Waiho River, where some 4 or 5 parties are gold digging and have their huts. One of them, Mr. Jim Nisbet, having been there for over 20 years. His hut is on the north side of the river, just below where the left-hand branch, or Callery River, joins the Glacier Branch, or Waiho. From Nisbet's hut, a small foot track runs along the bank of the former river for half a mile to a wire suspension footbridge, which spans the stream some 50 feet above the water, at the mouth of a magnificent gorge. This is one of the finest gorges I know, within easy reach of tourists. The river is a large glacier-fed stream, and descends very rapidly through a deep and narrow rocky gorge, above which the mountains rise abruptly to the height of 3,000 or 4,000 feet. The contrast of dark green bush on the almost precipitous hillsides, with the grey rock walls of the gorge rising 100 feet sheer and overhanging out of the river, which comes boiling and roaring down over immense boulders, is very grand, while in the distance between the bush-clad hills can be seen the glaciers of Drummond's Peak, some miles up the Callery River. On the small level piece of ground between the 2 branches, and at the foot of a rounded hill, the Doughboy, there's a digger's hut called the Hospital, and a few chains further on, the bank of the glacier, or right-hand branch, are some hot springs, of which more will be said. The county council bought this hut for the use of tourists and others who visited the hot springs, but as only 1 or 2 come in the year, Andrew Gordon and A. Woodham, working a claim close by, had taken possession. By the hot springs, another footbridge spanned the glacier branch, but that was swept away in February 1894 by a flood. However, we used it constantly while there. The government are now building another across the Waiho, below the junction of the 2 rivers, from Nisbet's hut to the south bank, and have formed a fair horse track to the terminal face of the glacier. After crossing the second footbridge, we had only 1 1/2 miles to go to the spot chosen for our head camp, which we pitched on November 1st, in some tall scrub within 400 yards of the glacier. To this point numerous persons had been in the past, but the glacier and the upper valley had not been touched, presumably because no one having any knowledge of icecraft had been there. Our camp has not yet been described, and, as it is the simplest and best form of shelter for a party of 2 working in rough country and near forest or scrub, an exact description of it may prove useful. It is an invention of Douglas's, and we call it a batwing. In the ordinary course of camp life, survey parties can have their loads packed on horseback, and carry tent and fly, with a second smaller fly to pitch at the end of the tent to shelter the fire. We, however, have to carry all our goods and chattels on our backs, and over very rough, unexplored country, so could not afford to take such a weighty camp. We therefore pitch an ordinary 6-foot by 8-foot canvas tent on a ridgepole with an 8-foot by 10-foot fly 6 inches above it, and cut the tent in half along the ridge, and taking away 1/2, leave the other standing. This is just large enough to allow 2 men to lie heads and tails. The front or side is left open, and one side of the fly, which was over the half taken away, is raised about 4 feet in the middle, and the 2 corners slightly less. Under this the fire burns about 3 feet away from the remaining half of the tent, so that in wet weather we have shelter for ourselves and fire, and save more than half the weight, and though rather cramped for room, are fairly comfortable. Should a heavy gale of wind make the shelter too cold, or cause discomfort by blowing the smoke into the batwing, we make a breakwind of ferns or branches across in front to protect us. We never have more than this to cover us, and often when necessary to travel in light order, trust to finding some friendly rock to sleep under, or build a mai-mai with bark and ferns. Our stores arrived by pack-horse next day from Maporika, a ford rather below Nesbitt's hut, having been found for the horses. Having made ourselves fairly comfortable and ready for a long stay, I spent the afternoon in looking about the terminal face and reconnoitring to determine our best mode of attacking the very rough glacier in front of us. The exact position of the terminal face of the Franz Josef Glacier is lat. south 43 degrees 25 minutes 30 seconds, long east 170 degrees 10 minutes 58 seconds, or rather nearer the equator than Florence in Italy. It comes down to within 14 miles of the sea, to an altitude of only 692 feet above sea level. It is about half a mile broad, and showed an upper layer of white ice pushing its way over a lower layer which carried dirt and stones. There are 5 isolated roches moutonnées standing at intervals across the valley at the terminal face. On the right-hand side is the Sentinel Rock, 236 feet high, the largest. A few feet to the left comes the Müller Rock, 60 feet high. The Strontian Rock lies nearly 3 chains further to the left, and is about 160 feet high. And lastly, the Barren Rock, 50 feet in height, lies near the river, which flowed out on the extreme left or east side of the glacier. Behind the Sentinel Rock, with the ice still pressing against it, is a rock, since named the Harper Rock, about 170 feet in height, with some moraine debris on its summit, which must have been deposited within the last few years, as no moss or vegetation was to be seen there. Some 8 chains to the left, and still surrounded by ice, the Park Rock, 190 feet, lies behind the Strontian, and is raked by a running fusillade of falling ice from the towering pinnacles behind. For the purpose of understanding this interesting array of rocks across the valley, reference can be made to the sketch plan of the terminal face of Franz Josef Glacier, given in Chapter 11. The best point from which to get a general idea of the valley and glacier is the Sentinel Rock, and thither I went as soon as possible to form a plan of attack. The glacier being in such warm latitude and low altitude, and having such a rapid descent, is naturally very much broken and crevassed. From the Sentinel the great icefall can be seen at a distance of 2 3/4 miles, descending in a little over a mile, 1,800 feet. Even from such a distance it presents a grand appearance. Below it, the glacier sweeps round a slight bend, and comes straight down in gigantic waves to the terminal face. There are evidently rocks of the same kind as those exposed at the snout, under the ice for some way up the valley, as the glacier has the appearance of heaving or lurching from side to side on its way down between high rocky walls, which rise out of the ice. The idea conveyed to my mind was that of water forced at an angle into a narrow rocky channel, and forming waves which rebounded from one side to the other obliquely across the course of the stream. The extent and height of these waves may be seen from some measurements taken just above Cape Defiance, assuming the south bank to be 0. The heights taken every 160 yards across the glacier were as follows: 0, 21, 80, 40, 95, 55, 177, 229, and 205 feet. The glacier flows from south to north, and after leaving the neve and coming down over the steep slope which forms the ice fall, it enters a narrow rock-bound valley of a little over half a mile in width. On the eastern or left-hand side, looking up, the rock slopes back for some 200 to 300 feet and then disappears into luxuriant timber, which clothes the hills up to the usual limit. This rocky bank is cut here and there into deep gorges and bluffs by streams from the hills. On the western side, the range rises abruptly out of the ice. For the first 300 to 500 feet, a bare, ice-worn precipice, fringed with scrub and bush, growing on almost precipitous hillsides, for some thousands of feet above. Here and there, fine waterfalls drop over the cliffs into the ice. The surface of the glacier, contrary to the general rule with New Zealand glaciers, is practically clear of debris, with exception of a narrow strip along the western side coming from a patch of rocks near the head of the ice fall. This accumulates in the bend above Cape Defiance, a promontory of rock which obstructs the flow of ice on the western side about 2 miles up the glacier, and continues until it joins a larger piece of surface moraine about half a mile from the terminal face, evidently caused by a slip a year or 2 previous. The debris left by the slip will no doubt have fallen over the terminal face and entirely disappeared by the end of 1898. The very broken nature of the glacier is the real cause of its cleanliness and freedom from surface moraine, as the debris falls into crevasses and comes out at the terminal face in the lower layer of dirty ice. From the general appearance of the valley, it was evident that the best plan would be to cross the river and get on to the eastern bank, for the ice looked too rough for a practical route, and the western side was too precipitous to attempt. Accordingly, on November the 4th, after some heavy rain, I went across to the outlet and endeavoured without success to pass over the river on the glacier, while Douglas went down to Nesbitt's hut to bring up the remainder of our stores, which had been left there owing to a flood in the river. I found that the ice was very soft and broken all along the side, and that it was unsafe to attempt a landing on the bank near the terminal face. In fact, it was a decidedly difficult business to get up the sheer ice face onto the glacier. The only course left open to us was to try and force a way straight up the glacier. On the 7th we managed, after some gymnastic feats, to reach a point about 1 mile up the glacier on the western side, but the last 120 yards having taken an hour amongst very bad seracs, we gave up the attempt and returned to camp. The following morning was spent in again trying to get over the river on the ice to the eastern bank, without success, and in the afternoon we went onto the glacier behind the Sentinel Rock, which appeared, from subsequent examination, to be the only possible route to reach the more level ice in the centre. From this point we made our way up and across the glacier by slow degrees, crawling between crevasses and cutting steps up and down high and almost perpendicular hummocks, and after 3 hours were able to step ashore on the eastern bank, about a mile from the terminal. For 200 or 300 feet above the ice, the hillside is bare, ice-worn rock, sloping back at an angle of 25 degrees, and along this we went for a short distance until a deep gorge stopped us. As it was late, we decided to return to camp and move it up to a suitable place on this bank, at the same time bringing up a spare rope to fix at the gorge. We always take a dog with us to catch kiwis, etc. for food, but as our work for some weeks would be on the ice, it was necessary to dispense with the dog's company. When I joined Douglas, I found he had an old friend, Betsy, a black, purebred mongrel, as he called her, and up to this point she had been a faithful, though somewhat useless companion. Accordingly, while Douglas took her down to the beach for an old digger friend to look after her for a time, I went off to the small farm on the Totara River, obtained half a sheep, and returned to the hospital to sleep. Before returning to camp on the following day, I had a bathe in the hot springs. On nearly every river on the west coast, there are mineral hot springs. Their heat is not due in any way to volcanic agency, and though I have tried to obtain an analysis of the water, some accident has always happened, and I have failed to get particulars. It is generally the case that a mile or so before the river emerges from the hills, a mineral spring is to be found in the bed of the stream, in which case the water will be hot. Sometimes, however, the spring is a few feet above the river level and only warm. The two best I know are those on the Waiho, a mile and a half below the glacier, and on the Fox River, a mile from the Fox Glacier. In each case they are situated in the riverbed, covered at flood time, and often, after the river has resumed its normal level, they are completely buried in gravel. On the flat near the hospital, hot water can be found almost anywhere. At the depth of 6 feet, it would be warm, at 8 feet below the surface, or on the edge of the riverbed the temperature is 120 degrees, and at 10 feet, or 2 feet below the riverbed, the temperature is 132 degrees, the hottest I obtained. Their rise and fall correspond with that of the river, showing great activity when the latter is high. In order to have a good bathe, the plan was to take a long-handled shovel, scoop out a hollow, and letting it fill in with water, lie down in it and stew. If, however, the bath proves uncomfortably hot, it is easy to let in a little ice water from the river a yard or two away, or even catch a piece of floating ice and place it in the pool. It was a new and pleasing sensation to lie in a hot spring under the shade of tree ferns and enjoy the glorious view of a glacier within a mile and a half, ploughing its way down between steep hills, clothed in luxuriant forest, and backed by high snow and ice-clad peaks. When going up a river, there is no difficulty in locating these springs, for their smell is strong and rather objectionable. Douglas said that, quote, "You smell as if you've been having tea with the evil one inside an old gasometer," end quote, after having a bathe in one of them. I cannot vouch for the correctness of the comparison, as I have never had tea under such conditions, but can quite imagine the combination would produce much the same effect. On Douglas's return, we moved camp and some 3 weeks' provisions across the glacier and along the eastern side to a point about a mile and a half up the valley, and ascending 400 feet up the ice-worn rocks, found a capital camping place amongst great rata trees and alongside a clear stream of water which ran in a deep, water-worn channel down to the glacier, with many small pools in which to bathe. Situated as we were at Camp 2, in fine rata bush, with a luxuriant undergrowth of tree ferns and other plants, which in England would be called semi-tropical vegetation, it was difficult to believe that we were a mile and a half up and 300 feet above a glacier. Through an opening in the trees in front of our batwing, lofty snow-capped peaks could be seen a mile away across the valley, rising in precipices from steep slopes clothed with dark green bush, while below a pure white glacier flowed at our feet, presenting as fine an instance of crevassed and broken ice as could be wished. A near view of alpine peaks, with a foreground of trees, is of course met with in many places, but it is doubtful whether the beautiful combination of tree ferns, semi-tropical vegetation, glacier and snow-clad mountains can be seen anywhere else except on the Fox Glacier. From the rocky platform at the edge of the bush, a few yards from the camp, we overlooked the glacier flowing past in great broken waves, down to the terminal face, beyond which were glimpses of the river as it wound in and out of the old moraine hillocks, covered with luxuriant timber, to the large river flats below. And 14 miles away, the blue sea was plainly visible, with the white horses raised by a squall of wind. One result of the neighborhood of the ice is that alpine plants, such as the nai-nai, broom, daisies, and edelweiss, are found growing amongst the vegetation of the low country. I found one plant of the last named growing within 800 feet of sea level on the Sentinel Rock. It does not appear to grow more luxuriantly at so low an altitude, but on the whole is rather stunted. Finding the ice at the side of the glacier very rotten, we attempted to continue along the side, and succeeded in reaching a rocky cape, which rose about a half mile further up the valley. On ascending the point, we discovered that the rock side had lost its gentle slope, and rose out of the ice in a perpendicular face of several hundred feet, smooth and ice-worn. There was no route along here, so we returned, looking out for a place where we could cross the rough side ice and reach the more level surface in the center of the glacier. The whole of the 16th was spent in trying to find a route onto the glacier. At 70 or 80 yards from the side, broad crevasses ran across and along the line of flow. Consequently, though the surface was fairly level, it was cut up into huge seracs and hummocks. After 5 unsuccessful attempts, we found a fairly good route, which, however, necessitated some peculiar acrobatic performances. Twice or thrice, I had to let Douglas down bodily into a crevasse, so that he could cut steps up to me, the side being too perpendicular to allow us to cut downwards in comfort, and then I had to cut steps up again on the other side for perhaps 40 feet, using the axe with only one hand and holding onto the ice with the other. No doubt, had the glacier been at a higher altitude, there would have been no difficulty in finding several routes, but here the ice was terribly rotten. Occasionally we would hear a report like a pistol shot, or louder, and feel a tremble under our feet, or see a large serac fall down, which looked strong enough to stand for days. Under these circumstances, therefore, we had to be most careful to choose a good line, because it had been decided to move camp again to Cape Defiance, a mile or so further up, on the opposite side, in order to have a good point from which to attack the great icefall and do our work on the neve. If weather came on and delayed us in the upper camp for a week, it would be possible that our retreat to Camp 2 would be cut off by reason of the frequent changes in the surface ice. Having spent some days in survey work and wet weather, on the 22nd we each took 40-pound loads, including camera and instruments, and made for Cape Defiance, 2,864 feet. It occupied just an hour and a quarter to go some 200 yards before we reached the good travelling in the center. When fossicking for this route the week previous, our gymnastic feats were most interesting and amusing, as we had only a camera to carry. But now, with our loads, we found it not only trying, but most difficult. The swags had to be lowered and pulled up again frequently, receiving very rough handling, regardless of their contents. The center of the glacier was fairly good going for a short distance, and then we got amongst some bad crevasses again, with long narrow ridges between. Often after crawling along several of these razorbacks, we would find our way blocked by a break in the ridge, and be compelled to retrace our steps and try another line. Luckily, anticipating some such work as this, I had brought a bundle of leafy twigs of rata to stick into the ice and mark our route, to save time on the return, because had we taken the wrong razorback at the start, we might have had an hour's work for nothing. Consequently, when we emerged from the rough ice close under Cape Defiance, there was a trail of rata twigs behind, which would ensure more speedy travel in the future. At Cape Defiance we found the only real piece of lateral moraine on the glacier, about 18 chains long. This cape, or point, is formed by a spur which projects across the flow of the glacier, and, narrowing the valley by 1/4 of a mile, causes the ice to back up behind it to a considerable height. On the upper side of the spur, the lateral moraine lies at right angles to the general flow of the glacier, the ice having swept down into the bed, and then, turning in an eddy, flowed along and around the cape. In the valley formed by the moraine and hillside, we built a level floor of large stones on which to place our batwing. Heavy rain had set in at noon, so we were fairly wet through and uncomfortable by the time we had pitched the camp. Behind us, the hillside had dense alpine scrub on it, and rose very steeply to the rocky pinnacles of Mount Moltke. To the right, a stream, quote, Harper's Creek, end quote, it has since been named, came down from the ice fields of the same peak. The valley down which this creek flows is very steep, and on the upper side has sheer rocky precipices, which are 2,000 feet high near the glacier, and as the valley rises they gradually become lower, until at the head they are only some 500 feet. Over this rock wall a waterfall, the Unser Fritz, descends in one leap 1,200
209 feet being the drainage of the Andermatten and Baumann glaciers on Mount Rune. In front of us was the grand icefall in all its glory, 1,800 feet or more in height and a mile wide, presenting a dazzling array of towering seracs and deep blue crevasses. I have seen many fine icefalls in Switzerland and New Zealand, but very much doubt if any, except perhaps the Haast Glacier on the Tasman, is as grand as that of the Franz Josef. Though I call it 1,800 feet in height, it may be said that for 3,000 feet at the least, the glacier is really an icefall. On the 24th, we made an attempt to force a way to the neve. After 3 hours, we reached the head of the icefall by means of a fairly smooth strip of ice caused by the inflow of the Almer Glacier on the left. It is generally the rule that where two glaciers join, the crevasses and seracs are much smaller than elsewhere. But after passing the junction, nothing could be done. The neve snow was within a quarter of a mile, smooth and white, but between us was a field of ice broken into seracs and crevasses in a manner which it is impossible to conceive without seeing. Douglas said it looked like a bird's-eye view of an eastern town with a deep blue street between each and every house. The seracs were all square and flat-topped, but surrounded by apparently bottomless crevasses. I could see that the only way to make a successful traverse up this glacier was in the early spring, when the winter snow would form bridges over this impossible piece of ice. It would only be waste of time to attempt to go any further, because nothing could be done without a ladder of at least 25 feet. It was also raining heavily, so we returned to camp and spent the afternoon in making sundry observations, etc. On the following morning we went up the spur behind the camp to 5,000 feet or so in order to get some compass shots into the upper basin of the neve. From this point the outlook was splendid. Immediately on the right, across Harper's Creek, within a few chains, was the great Unser Fritz waterfall, with its two small glaciers and enormous precipices on each side. To the southeast we got a clear view for a short time into the main neve coming off Mount de la Beche, and the saddles leading into the Tasman Glacier. Opposite us we saw the Almer Glacier, a fine open ice field coming off Stirling Rock, behind which Drummond's Peak showed a peculiar array of tooth-like rocks rising out of the field of snow. On the other side of this range lies the Callery River, which joins the Waiho by the hospital. Over the low country to the north, the view was good, but limited. The glacier to the terminal face lay 2,000 feet below at the foot of great precipices, over which a grand series of waterfalls fell with a roar into the ice. Beyond it lay Lake Maporika, and the sea-coast was easily visible to the Wataroa bluff. The clouds, however, soon hid everything, and more heavy rain compelled our descent to camp. Next morning, in still bad weather, we retired down the glacier to Camp 2, having decided that no route lay up the ice to the neve. The ice on the line of route had altered very much, even during the last 3 or 4 days, and had it not been for my rata twigs left on the way up, we should have had hard work to find a way. Sometimes we would see a piece of rata 30 feet away and take a quarter of an hour to work round to it. The ice at the place where we had to leave the glacier was even more altered than elsewhere, and it was difficult to recognize the way which we had followed when getting on from the rocks. However, by lowering Douglas to cut steps once or twice, we were able to come off safely and reach Camp 2 at 4 p.m., pretty wet and hungry. We now decided to try a high-level route along the top of the range, behind the camp, onto the Almer neve, and across it, over a shoulder of Stirling Rock, to the main neve. This would involve a considerable amount of track-cutting or blazing in the dense bush and scrub, and probably with the bad weather we were having, would take some time. I therefore went to Camp 1 at the terminal face, and Douglas went on to the township at Maporika for more stores. Unfortunately, while there, he had a bad attack of influenza, lasting nearly 3 weeks, and so, beyond perfecting the survey and taking some observations of glacier motion, little could be done for the present. In naming the tributary glaciers and peaks which had not already received names from the low country trigonometrical stations, we used those of Swiss guides in Almer, Croz, Baumann glaciers, etc. It is often hard to find names, so we use those of one class for one valley and another class for another locality as far as possible. End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand by Arthur Paul Harper. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 5. Waiho River, the High Country. Trek cutting, dry camp, number 5. Wekas, another failure. Mapurika, Mount Moltke Spur, Camp 6, Camp 7. Gale and shipwreck. Return, Callery River, heavy flood, marching orders. On Douglas's return, we began to blaze our track to the grass line behind Camp 2. This very trying business is so constantly necessary that I must try and convey some idea of the work. The undergrowth in the bush is, as a rule, so bad that progress is very slow, even without a load on one's back. But when carrying anything, it is almost impossible to make any way at all. It is therefore a saving of time to take a billhook and blaze, or cut a narrow track, before attempting to carry any load through the undergrowth. When climbing a hill to reach the grass line, this is more necessary than when traveling on flat country, and an ascent of 1,500 feet is a good day's work. Often in the ranges, the bush is fairly open, from 1,500 feet to 2,500 feet above sea level, consisting of large trees and little undergrowth. But at the latter altitude, mountain vegetation begins to appear amongst the trees, and at 3,000 feet, the true impenetrable mountain scrub has to be faced. This varies from 10 to 3 feet in height, and its denseness can hardly be appreciated by those who have not experienced it. I have seen it thick enough to walk and crawl on top of, and in nearly every locality a 5,000-foot ascent is a good day's work. Sometimes it is literally too tangled to force a way through without a billhook to clear a track, even when carrying no load, and any attempt would leave very few garments on the back of the man who tried. The only stuff I know which is impervious to the stiff pointed ends of the stunted vegetation is, quote, gabardine, end quote, made by T. Burberry and Son, Basingstoke, England. The track which had to be cut from Camp 2 to the grass line was my first experience of this sort of work, and I can safely recommend it to anyone wishing to test his vocabulary. 5 hours hard work only took me 600 feet up the hill, and now, after considerable experience in blazing, I have decided that a distance which takes an hour to cut will only take 4 or 5 minutes to go with a load on one's shoulders after it is cleared. We only clear a width of about 2 feet, sufficient to get our loads along in comfort. Owing to the wet weather and various other delays, it was 23rd of December before we had our camp pitched in the last piece of mountain scrub, some 4,000 feet above sea level, on the opposite side of the glacier to Cape Defiance and the Unserflitz Fall. We named this Dry Camp, or number 5, because there was only one small drip of water from an overhanging rock, which took some hours to fill the billy. 1,000 feet above the camp, there was a small peak from which the finest panorama in the district, without going above the snow line, can be obtained. Looking south from here was the great neve basin of the Franz Josef Glacier, with its tributary ice falls, the Agassiz, Melchior, etc., and beyond them were the fine rock peaks of the dividing range, including Mounts Spencer, 9,157 feet, Jervois, 8,675 feet, and another, 9,511 feet, which I named Conway's Peak, lying on the divide at the point from which the Bismarck Range branches to the north. Across the valley, this range, with its peaks, glaciers, and waterfalls, was seen for the whole of its length, and to the north the coastline could be followed, bluff after bluff, to the Wanganui River, and still further we could see the Paparoa Ranges north of Greymouth, between 90 and 100 miles away. When Douglas had rejoined me on the 16th December, we brought up some 10 days' stores only, thinking that would be ample for our projected expedition to the neve. However, the rain and Douglas's illness had kept us back, so we were compelled to economize our food. On Christmas Day we were in fog and could do nothing, so we reluctantly decided to kill one of the pair of wekas which had honoured us with their presence. As they had 2 young ones, we were unwilling to kill either of the birds, but a Christmas dinner looking very doubtful, we shot the male. Previously, I had shot a crow, and on opening the weka's crop, we had evidence of their extraordinary ideas of food, for in it was the copper cartridge case which had been used for the crow, already partly polished by the stones. Mrs. Weka seemed to take a great interest in our method of preparing her late husband for the stew, and on my throwing the remains aside, her reason was obvious. She at once seized the discarded parts and carried them in triumph to her young ones, no doubt saying, "Here, my dears, is part of your poor old father for a Christmas dinner." She then returned, carefully picked up and gave her promising young family all the remains of the stew. In the West Coast ranges, it is the exception if hilltops are clear of fog after noon in the summer, and generally the clouds form on them as early as 9 or 10 a.m. Consequently, though the weather is fine in the valleys, we are often unable to do any work on the tops, except in the very early morning. For 3 days fog prevented our taking observations at or near dry camp. Until we had done this, it was useless to go on to the neve. The delay necessitated further supplies, and was the more inconvenient because our drip of water had ceased. On the 27th, Douglas went to Camp 2 for some flour, and I took the 2 billies down to a creek, 6,000 feet below, for water, and shot a bird or 2. The 29th saw us with light loads of 30 pounds, pushing along the rotten rocky spur toward the neve of the Almer Glacier, but again we were doomed to disappointment. At noon we came to a deep gorge, walled by rotten cliffs, down which stones were constantly falling. After an hour's work, we managed to find a fair route into the gorge, but the other side was too rotten to ascend. There is no doubt a party of 3 could traverse this side without much trouble, but we did not consider it safe for 2 men to put so much dangerous ground behind them if any other route existed, because should any accident occur to one, I doubt if the other could have got out alone. Also, Douglas had been shaken by his recent attack of influenza, and was not fit to do such a difficult and long day as we should have before us. Wherever the schist formation ends and the slate begins, we find terribly shattered rocks, and when this occurs in a precipitous locality, it is often quite impossible to traverse the steep faces with real safety. The gorge that turned us back was near the point of junction of the 2 formations, and had enormous masses of rotten rock ready to fall. In fact, we could hardly touch any projecting stone, however large, without dislodging it. Having christened the gorge No-Go Creek, we returned to dry camp and, gathering all our goods, left them at 5 p.m. for Camp 2, which we reached at 8 p.m. On the last day of the year, we moved Camp 2 down to our old terminal face quarters, and found that the ice behind the Sentinel had so changed that it gave us great trouble to find a route off the glacier at all. During the next 3 weeks, we had some very bad weather and floods, which considerably delayed my work on Lake Maporika, which I had been sent to survey before we did any further work at the glacier. This and other lakes on the low country lie between high moraine hills left by ancient glaciers. They are all supposed by the inhabitants to be bottomless. I do not know why, except that people seem to look upon a bottomless lake as a luxury, and are very angry with the man who destroys the illusion. The general rule is that they are not quite so deep as their height above sea level. Maporika lies about 275 or 300 feet above the sea, so I offered to bet that the lake was under 300 feet in depth, but no one would accept, for they said they knew the lake was bottomless. When I sounded in 14 places and found bottom always within 280 feet, many of the inhabitants of the district took it as a personal insult and have never quite forgiven me. While camping on the shore of the lake, I heard the cry of the rua, or large brown kiwi, now nearly extinct and very valuable. I believe there are 1 or 2 pairs in this locality. Thanks to a flood putting one of my camps 4 feet under water and otherwise delaying my work, it was the 25th of January, 1894, when I rejoined Douglas at the glacier. He had been laying off a line for a horse track from Nesbitt's to the terminal face. We now decided to go along the spur on the western side of the glacier, and if necessary ascend Mount Roon, so as to complete our map of the neve. As Douglas was yet feeling far from well, we asked A. Woodham, one of the diggers, to come and give us a helping hand for the 10 days we expected to be away. It was 2 days before we had our track blazed and camp pitched 2,700 feet above the flat. The view from Camp 6 of the glacier was quite the prettiest picture we saw, for the glacier could be seen from the neve to near the snout through a framework of nai and other trees. The nai is a mountain scrub and grows up to 30 feet in height. Its foliage is like a large pineapple head. Some plants have only straight stems with 1 head, while others have gnarled and twisted limbs with 100 heads. The shape of the tuft on the head of the branches gives a tropical appearance to the scene, and as it only grows in any quantity near the grass line on the west coast, it is rarely difficult to obtain a foreground of apparently tropical vegetation with a distance of snow and ice, a combination at once curious and beautiful. The grass line was 1,000 feet above Camp 6, and it took Woodham and me 2.5 days to cut through the scrub for that height. I never experienced before or since such an impenetrable tangle of vegetation, of stunted, hard, stubborn, aki-aki, broom, etc. This mountain scrub to a great extent grows downhill, that is, when ascending you have the branches pointing towards you. Consequently, it is difficult to get into a shrub to cut a limb off near the ground. In places, it is not unlike meeting a number of fixed bayonets pointing at you, and trying to cut the rifle off at the stock with a billhook without room to swing it properly. On the 1st of February, we shouldered our loads and made along the high ridge towards Mount Moltke, but at noon a fog came up, and at 3 p.m. the dry fog changed to a wet mist, a sure sign of a storm. We could not see 30 yards ahead, so decided to go down on our right and camp, because it was the lee side of the ridge, and also because the slopes toward the glacier were practically precipices. After descending 500 feet in the fog, we came to a precipice, and on going to the right and left, found more sheer rocks. The mist was too thick to see how deep or of what kind these faces were, so having found a small patch of scrub growing on the hillside, we decided to stay where we were. It took an hour to cut a flat shelf 6 feet by 8 feet out of the hillside with our ice axes. On this shelf we pitched our fly, stretched on a rope between 2 ice axes, and tied down in every possible direction to the long snowgrass. We were thoroughly wet by this time, and the wind was whistling over the ridge above us from the northwest. Douglas had a dry shirt, and I had a pair of light canvas trousers to put on, and Woodham had a complete change, so we hung our wet garments outside, there being no chance of a good enough fire to dry them, and put our blankets round us. We were, however, able to make a small fire of scrub for boiling the billy, and having a good drink of hot cocoa, turned in. All that night and the next day it blew a hurricane, but this did not affect us much, as we were on the lee side of the ridge. Over our heads we could see the grass and lily leaves whirling about, having been literally torn up by the roots. And between the blinding squalls of rain, we watched the sea whipped into one sheet of foam by the squalls. The high wind and heavy rain dispersed the fog of the previous day, and enabled us to look at our surroundings and see where we had got to, a point which we had been unable to decide the previous evening. From Conway's Peak, at the extreme south corner of the Franz Josef Glacier, the Bismarck Range branches off in a northwesterly direction towards the coast, dividing for 1.5 miles its neve from that of the Fox Glacier. At this point, a short ridge, the Chancellor, branches off for 5 miles nearly due west, and 1.5 miles further on the Bismarck Range is Mount Anderegg, 8,360 feet, which sends an offshoot to the west for about 7 miles. Between these two diverging ranges the Victoria Glacier lies, and beyond them the Fox Glacier flows, first along the Chancellor Ridge, and then passing the snout of the Victoria Glacier, continues along the foot of the second range. Anderegg's Peak and Mount Roon, 7,344 feet, which lies 1 mile north of it, gives rise to the Fritz Glacier, which is bounded on the south by the second range, and on the north by a spur which comes off Mount Moltke, 6,509 feet, a peak a little north of Roon. The Fritz Glacier is the source of the Waikukupa River. On Mount Moltke is a small ice field which sends its drainage to the east down Harper's Creek by Cape Defiance, and to the north gives rise to the Oemerua River. After leaving Moltke, the Bismarck Range continues north for 4 miles, sending off several short abrupt spurs to the west, between which are valleys some 1,500 feet in depth, walled by high precipitous sides. These are drained by Dry Creek, which flows into the Waiho River 6 miles below the glacier. Some idea of the great steepness of these valleys and ridges may be gained by the fact that, near the head of Dry Creek, a straight line could be taken for 1.25 miles in length, which would cross 3 ridges of 5,090 feet and 2 valleys of 1,500 to 2,000 feet deep. This is often the case on the west coast ranges. The main chain of the Southern Alps sends off more spurs and branch ranges of considerable altitude on the western slope than on the eastern. All these have deep valleys between them and descend from 10,000 feet and upwards to within 500 feet of sea level in a distance of less than 10 miles. Those valleys in which there are glaciers present high precipitous sides of rock, and in the lower portions the rivers descend through dark bush-clad or bare rocky gorges, beautiful scenery, but ugly from the unfortunate explorer's point of view. On the 2nd of February, when the fog cleared, we found ourselves camping on a very steep hillside, near the head of one of the branches of Dry Creek. The other side of the valley, for 1,000 feet or more, was almost a precipice, with grass and stunted scrub clinging to it in places. The storm still raged furiously, and as our aneroids had fallen 1.10 inches during the night, Douglas and I put on our wet clothes and made the fly ropes taut, gathered some bits of scrub for the fire, and retired again to our blankets. So long as the wind came from the northwest, it was fairly warm, and we were more or less sheltered by the spur above us. But about 2 hours after dark, it veered round as usual to the southwest, and blew with all its force onto our shelter, bringing with it hail and sleet instead of rain. There is a fixed rule, which rarely has an exception, as to weather on the west coast, namely, that northwest wind always brings heavy rain, followed by southwest hail and rainstorms for a day, and then fine weather again till the next nor'wester. As soon as the wind therefore veered round to the southwest, we knew that 24 hours would see fine weather, and as the temperature fell, our spirits rose. Douglas had turned in his dry shirt. I was in my thin canvas trousers only, but Woodham, luckily for himself, had on plenty of clothes. Towards midnight the gale increased, and the wind howled round us in furious gusts, trying to dislodge the fly, which was flapping about in an alarming manner. Douglas had just said, "It's deuced lucky that we tied her down so well," when a squall struck us again, and after a brief struggle with the canvas, it broke a rope, and in half a second the whole arrangement had gone away in the darkness. Up we all scrambled, Douglas and I in our airy costume, as there was no time to find and put on our wet clothes, and began to struggle with the canvas. The wind seemed literally to leap on us, driving the hail with almost irresistible force, and making it very difficult to rig up any kind of shelter. After nearly a quarter of an hour battling with the fly, tumbling over one another in the dark, and slipping down on the wet and steep grass with our bare feet, we managed to put up a rough shelter. Cold as I was, with my almost naked body, I almost smiled at Douglas's wild appearance, seen at intervals in the uncertain light, when we came near one another, his solitary garment fluttering in the wind, and every moment a hasty remark would be heard as he slipped with his bare legs on the wet grass. Neither Douglas, in his long years of exploration, nor I, have had our shelters blown away before, and if the hail stung his bare legs as it stung my bare back and chest, I feel sure neither of us will ever neglect a precaution which would prevent another such experience. As soon as we had any shelter at all, we got under it, and allowed Woodham to finish fixing the ropes. We then donned our wet garments, having wrung them out, and, rolled in our wetter blankets, lay waiting for dawn. Poor old Douglas was chilled to the bone, and I really feared he would be unable to face the storm and journey down at daybreak. As soon as the first streak of light allowed us to see, Woodham began to kindle a fire. Everything was wet as possible, but by burning a candle and dropping the grease onto a piece of rag, and lighting that, he gradually charred and dried enough twigs to make a blaze. In 2 hours we had a billyful of boiling cocoa, and with the help of that soon made Douglas warm. My young bones and blood did not get the cold into them like his, for there is a great difference in the staying powers of a man under 30 and one over 50 years of age. At noon the wind was still blowing a gale, so we decided to go down to the hospital and leave everything where it was. When we reached the top of the ridge, the fog came again, and we found the force of the wind very great. Several times we had to lie down for some seconds, or we should have been blown away like flies. Whenever possible, we descended and traversed the steep face on the lee side of the ridge. At one time we must have been in a thundercloud, as our axes hummed. In 3 or 4 hours we reached the shelter of the bush, and at 7 p.m. arrived at the hospital where dry clothes, a good fire, and hot tea made us happy. This was Woodham's first experience on the higher country, and he said it would be his last. He thought it a very poor game. But his disgust was only temporary. He was far too enterprising a man to be so easily daunted. In 2 days the weather cleared, and we returned to the scene of our late discomfort to complete our work and bring down the things. On the way we called in at Camp 1 at the terminal face and found it blown down, and all my photographic plates, which had been exposed up the glacier, had been exposed a second time to 2 days' rain. Eventually it proved that not many were spoiled, but this is an instance of the difficulties which I had to contend against for my photographs. Having gone along the ridge beyond our camp to a point from which we could get observation into the neve and complete the map, we picked up our camp and returned to the diggers' huts. The only incident worth mentioning which occurred on our second trip along the ridge was one which might have been a serious accident. The outer ranges often have deep and narrow fissures in the rock after reaching the grass line. Sometimes these are 300 feet deep or more, and only a few feet broad, easily hidden by the long snowgrass. On this spur there were several small ones, a foot or two broad, and perhaps 20 to 50 feet deep. Coming down the grass ahead of Douglas, I heard a coo-ee from above, and being unable to see him on looking up, I returned and heard another below me. So I went down again, thinking I had been mistaken, when a third cry came from behind. Putting down my load, I was again ascending when I heard a voice on my right. "You might pull a chap out of a hole." It appears that poor Douglas had walked into one of those fissures, which was luckily narrow, and his load had jammed, preventing him from falling below his shoulders. We soon had him out, none the worse for the mishap. On reaching the diggers' huts with our various belongings a day or two later, we were greeted with news of the gale, which had done an immense amount of damage all over the district. Roads were blocked, houses blown down, and no prospect of the mail getting through for some time. Douglas now had another attack of his influenza, brought on by the recent chill, and he retired down to more comfortable quarters at the lake. I stayed on the hospital with the diggers, and spent my time in preparing the map and going up and along the Burster Ridge on the north side of the Callery River to get bearings and photographs into the head of that river and the Totra. There is gold in the reaches of the river above the gorge, and several diggers have been into the upper valley. No possible route exists through the gorge itself, owing to the very precipitous sides, so a track has been blazed up Mount Muller, 3,700 feet, and along the ridge to the grass line. This ridge is easy but tiring, yet the inhabitants of the district look upon it as a breakneck and difficult journey. Several young fellows have been so frightened by the travellers' tales told by the older diggers that they would sooner do anything than try to go over the Burster. The Callery River drains Mount Elie de Beaumont, 10,200 feet, which sends down two fine ice fields, the Burton and the Spencer, both primary glaciers. The saddle at the actual source of the river, a mile or two above the Burton Glacier, leads probably into the Wataroa River, nearly under the Lindenfeld Saddle, which lies at the extreme head of the Great Tasman Glacier. At present, the topography of the upper waters and tributaries of the Wataroa River is very uncertain, but I think it is safe to assume that the Lindenfeld and Callery saddles lead into the same valley. I have never been on the former, but knowing the western ranges so well, could easily decide the point, and hope before long to be able to do so. From the Burster, Mount Elie de Beaumont is a beautiful cone, rising out of the two glaciers, to its right Mount Green, 9,325 feet, and the minarets are seen rising out of the neve of the same glacier, the Spencer. A pass could be made between Green and Elie de Beaumont, onto the head of the Tasman Glacier, opposite Mount Darwin. About the middle of February, we had 5 days of heavy rain, and several slips occurred on the glacier branch, causing the bed of the river to rise 8 or 10 feet, with gravel and other debris. The result was that the water overflowed its usual flood channels, and, cutting in behind the wire bridge above the hospital, washed away its supports. The bridge consequently gradually became less taut, and at last touched the water. Strong as the wire ropes were, they hardly resisted the rushing torrent for a second, but snapped like twine, and the whole structure collapsed. A flood of such magnitude is worth seeing. On the glacier branch, great icebergs, which had broken off from the glacier, careered madly along, crashing and colliding against one another, and huge boulders could be heard bumping down under the water. In the Callery Gorge, the water was 30 feet above its normal level, and on emerging from its narrow rock-bound channel onto the more open ground, it spread out right and left in huge waves. Trees and stones were swept along with tremendous speed and force. After the river subsided, we found a mass of ice blocks stranded amongst the trees in the bush by the hut. All the claims were filled with debris and unworkable for days, and in some cases the men had to wait for weeks until the river had scoured out some of the gravel in its bed and lowered its level, thus enabling them to get sufficient fall to carry away their tailings. As soon as I could find a horse on which to ford the river, I went up to the glacier to see what damage the flood had done. In places, the terminal face had retreated 5 or 6 yards, owing to the masses of ice which had broken away, and at the outlet on the east side there appeared the finest ice cave I have ever had the pleasure of seeing. It was 100 feet high and about the same breadth, while quite 50 yards inside a ray of sunlight could be seen coming through some crevasse which had opened through the ice above. At that point the cave seemed to still maintain its dimensions, but beyond was inky darkness. This glacier had since 1867 been well known at its terminal face, as it only necessitates a ride of 14 miles up an open riverbed from the sea. Beyond, the snout only had been explored. 20 years or more before our visit, Douglas says he remembers hearing of some Maoris who were prospecting for gold with the early diggers on the river flats, going up to look at the ice. At that time it came down to the Sentinel Rock, and the large cave out of which the river flowed was between the Muller and the Strauchan Rocks. The Maoris, on seeing this, imagined that it was a tunnel through the ranges to some unknown country on the other side, from which all gold came. So they brought up a large dugout canoe, and having obtained some short poles with steel hooks on the end, they started into the cave on a voyage of discovery, using the hooks against the icy walls. After they had gone in some little distance, it is presumed a block of ice fell near them, or they heard one of the cracks or groans which we so often heard on this glacier, because the canoe suddenly shot out into daylight again, and her crew jumped ashore saying the typo, devil, was in the cave. I ought perhaps to have mentioned before that Waiho means smoky waters. It is difficult to decide whether the Maoris named it because of the very milky appearance of the water, or because of the peculiarly thick white fog which hangs over the stream, not encroaching at all on the banks, but only covering the actual water. The river has more silt coming down it than any other on the coast, and its water is very milky at the mouth. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand by Arthur Paul Harper. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 6 Cook River, Balfour Glacier. Old Moraines, Beach Travelling and Digging, Gillespie's, Ryan's Range, Balfour Glacier, A Race with the Clouds, Topsy. At the end of February, instructions came for us to go without delay to Cook River and explore all its branches. Some years ago, the track or road which skirts the outer hills southwards from Ross was continued from Maporika, across the Waiho River, some 3 miles below the glacier, and thence over the Oemerua and Waikukupa rivers to Cook River. The distance by this road does not exceed 12 miles, but it had been allowed to grow over, and is now worse to tackle than bush in its natural state. Why the authorities should have allowed a track which cost a good sum of money to grow over is hard to say, possibly because the powers that be in Okarito and Gillespie's had sufficient influence to prevent its being kept open, for it diverted all the southern horse traffic from these 2 townships. However, the fact remained that, instead of being able to ride in an hour or 2 from the Franz Joseph Glacier to Cook's River, we had to go down the Waiho to the sea beach, and along it to Gillespie's township, and strike inland some 8 miles to a small farm on Cook River Flats, 35 miles of bad going, taking a day and a half. Having procured a horse on which to carry our property, we left the hospital and our digger friends on the 7th March, and followed the Waiho riverbed to the beach, went to the Mr. Gibbs' store and farm at Waikukupa, where we slept. Beach travelling is a distinct feature at present on the west coast. At low tide the sand is generally good, but at high tide the traveller is forced up into soft sand or gravel, and the going becomes tedious and painful. The whole of the lower country is formed of low moraine hills and terraces, reaching 400 feet in height, left there by the ancient glaciers. These have been cut through here and there by the rivers, and in many places they form high bluffs along the seashore, at the bottom of which large erratic boulders, loosened by the sea, are lying in confusion. At high tide, the surf, which is nearly always heavy, dashes over this mass of rocks and beats against the hard mass of moraine above them. Some of the bluffs are practically impassable except at low tide, and these have had narrow tracks cut over or round them. Others are in their natural state and are impassable at high water. Consequently, travelling along the beach has its excitement, for seas have to be dodged amongst the loose masses of rock strewn along the shore at the foot of a bluff. Frequently, after a storm, the sea throws up sand and gravel to such an extent that no rocks are visible, and the bluff can be passed on a good beach, but the next tide may destroy the good ground and leave the rocks naked again, or possibly the bluff may be filled up for weeks. 2 bluffs have to be passed before reaching Gibbs's house, both easy ones, and the Oeamarua and Waikukupa rivers have to be forded at their mouths. The rivers often have large lagoons behind the seawall, and these have an outlet into the sea, the lagoon filling up at high tide and nearly running out before the next tide. To cross the water, rushing down over shifting sand, is never pleasant, and can only be done at low or half tide, for the surf causes a strong undercurrent when it runs up the narrow channel against the stream. Fording, when the river is in dangerous condition or without due experience, has been the cause of many deaths. Hardly a river or creek on the coast exists which has not been answerable for 1 or more lives. From the Waikukupa, we reached Gillespie's by noon, a township consisting of 2 public houses, a store, and a few huts. It is indeed difficult to imagine a more dismal or depressing place than Gillespie's beach, or town, as they call it in the district. Some 6 or 7 huts and houses are scattered along the old sea-wall of sandhills in a row, facing the sea. These include 2 public houses, a government school, and 1 store, the other store being part of 1 public house. On approaching it, no one is seen about the sandy track which connects the scattered houses, but suddenly one of the many canine mongrels, which are plentiful here, becomes aware of a stranger's presence. He gives tongue to his indignation, and, followed by other curs of low degree, notifies to all whom it may concern the fact that someone is coming. Up to this moment nothing worthy of notice has occurred, but no sooner has the signal been given than children of all ages and sexes spring up on every side, and after a short stare to see if they know you or not, bolt like rabbits to their houses, leaving the place again deserted. The stranger then, feeling that he cannot so insult the publican as not to look in for a drink, turns up from the beach to the sandhills and proceeds down the street towards the hotel. As he passes each house, out come the inhabitants, and, by the time he has reached the shelter of the bar-room, the whole available population of some 10 adults and 30 children are gazing at him. A few diggers live here, working for gold on the beach, or just behind the old seawall, and the rest of the population practically owe their means of livelihood to supplying these men and others in the district. This beach combing is sometimes profitable, as a great deal of surfacing, or black gold-bearing sand, is now and then deposited after a storm, and can be taken above high water mark before the next tide washes it away again. The gold obtained from this sand is very fine, sometimes not much coarser than flour. Above high water mark, on the sandhills forming the old seawall, gold-bearing sand is worked in many localities, but it is not on the whole profitable, only 15 shillings to 30 shillings a week being made. The average, however, is increased when a rich patch of surfacing is thrown up by a storm, and good gold obtained from it by those who are on the qui-vive. When journeying along the beach, huts belonging to men working the black sand are passed at long intervals, in lonely seclusion, on some flat, amongst the tall flax or scrub above the high water mark. Behind these is generally a piece of swampy ground to the foot of the morainic hills, which are covered with tall bush. Beyond again, within 20 miles, the great snowy ranges can be seen, towering up to 10,000 or 12,000 feet, with dark, gloomy valleys and rocky spurs descending very rapidly to the lower country. It is a wonderfully fine effect to see this magnificent panorama of mountains so close, closed with bush at their base, and rising range upon range to their ice-clad summits, while standing on the sea beach, with the heavy rollers just at one's back, crashing onto the shingle and roaring as they retire and draw the stones after them. From the beach near the Waikukupa to the summit of Mount Cook is about 20 miles as the crow flies, and is 8 or 9 miles to the foot of the outer flanks of the ranges, 500 feet above sea level. Therefore, the Southern Alps and their many buttresses rise at this point 12,000 feet in 8 miles, and can be seen for their whole height. A track has been formed from Gillespie's township up the Cook River Flats, where Mr. Ryan has a small farm about 8 miles distant, at the foot of the hills. To this we made our way in the afternoon after 2 hours' delay at the store, ordering provisions and necessaries. All the way down the coast, our ice axes had created great curiosity, and Douglas, who is of course known to every man, woman, and child south of the Wanganui River, overheard some remarks concerning these dangerous-looking implements. 4 or 5 men were standing round the swags, speculating as to the use of the ice axes. The first suggested that they were grubbers which had been sent down for Ryan. Another believed they were picks for fossicking gold in the ranges, and so on ad lib. At last a brilliant idea struck someone, and he said, "Why, they're fixings Charlie has invented for spearing eels." This appeared to solve the difficulty, as they adjourned for a drink. Cook River has, as I have already explained, 3 branches, the Fox, the Balfour, and the main branch. The first name comes from the Fox Glacier, which drains the dividing range from Conway's Peak to Mount Tasman, and is bounded on the east by the Bismarck Range and its branches, on the west by Craig's Range, a high offshoot from Mount Tasman, running northwest. The Balfour River flows from the glacier of that name, lying between the latter range and the Balfour Range, which branches off the divide from near the Silberhorn of Tasman, and runs due west for 9 or 10 miles. The main branch takes its rise from La Perouse, a fine glacier, which drains the divide from the Silberhorn of Tasman to Mount Stokes, and flows west between the Balfour and Copeland ranges. The latter range is an offshoot of Mount Stokes, and runs a little north of west, past Mount Copeland, 7,895 feet, and Little's Peak, 7,386 feet, to Ryan's Peak. At this point it branches in 2 directions, the northerly spur coming down close to the lower extremity of Craig's Range, having curled round past the lower end of the Balfour Range. The main branch of the river is joined by the Balfour stream, about 3 miles before it leaves the hills, and after flowing for 3 or 4 miles on the flat country, is joined by the Fox River. The hut to which we went on Ryan's farm after leaving Gillespie's is situated a mile or so above the inflow of the latter river. At the point where it leaves the hills, the main stream is spanned by a wire rope and cage, placed there for the benefit of 3 or 4 men who are digging a mile further up on the south bank. Gold has been obtained in the main branch and Balfour River, but is now nearly all worked out, only 2 claims existing at the present. Our plan of campaign was firstly to make an ascent on the lower end of the Copeland Range towards Ryan's Peak, in order to get some general observations and photographs into the upper portions of the 2 branches and the surrounding peaks, and then make our way to the Balfour Glacier, taking the Fox Glacier and the main branch afterwards. On March 12th, we took our camp to near the diggers' huts, and began to cut the track up a spur behind them. It took 2 days before we had cleared a track and pitched our camp at 3,000 feet, and, owing to wet and foggy weather, it was the 17th before we were able to do our work on the top of the range. Even then, we should have been unsuccessful had we not made a point of reaching our station by 7 a.m., so as to finish the bearing before the fog came. However, luck was on our side, and we were able to fix the station and return with the camp to the diggers' huts by the evening of the 17th. From the shoulder of Ryan's Peak we got a good idea of the topographical features of the watershed of Cook River, and could see the dividing range from Mount Elie de Beaumont to the Footstool. This is a good example of West Coast work, as compared with that of the eastern slopes of the Southern Alps. It will be seen that to fix a station at 5,000 feet took us 6 days, necessitating a camp at 3,000 feet, whereas on the eastern side of the main range, with its open grassy slopes and more certain climate, the whole thing could have been done in 1 day from our lower camp. On March 18th we moved off again, crossing by the cage to the opposite side of the river, and pitching camp in a perfect deluge of rain about half a mile above the diggers' huts. everything we had was wet, so the following morning was spent drying a few things before a large fire, and at noon we continued up the river to the inflow of the Balfour stream, at which point another, Craig's Creek, also joins the river, flowing from a small ice field on Craig's Peak. Douglas had explored this branch some years previously and found the gorge impassable. The route therefore lay up the creek for a mile or more, and thence over the spur which comes from Craig's Peak to the gorge, a climb of about 4,000 feet. Accordingly, we turned up the creek, which comes down very rapidly over large stones and between rocky sides, a stiff piece of going for us with our usual handicap of 50 pounds. Towards evening we reached a large erratic boulder about 40 feet high and 250 feet in circumference, under which we could find very fair shelter for the night, so we kindled a fire and turned in. Even this little valley had signs of ancient ice. The sides were 2,000 feet high and showed terraces of smooth, ice-worn rocks. It is possible that a glacier originally came from Craig's Peak down here and joined the main ice streams, but the valley is so short that it is difficult to account for a body of ice large enough to leave such distinct marks and so many erratics. Half a mile above the bivouac, a tributary stream comes off the spur over which we were going. We therefore next morning followed it up for half an hour, and then pitched the batwing in the last patch of mountain scrub. Douglas, on his previous visit, had found some good crystals on this spur, so we spent the day crystal hunting and found some nice specimens. I took my camera to the ridge, some 1,700 feet above camp, but failed to secure views owing to the inevitable fog. On the 21st, I made an early start with my load in order to obtain some photographs before the fog obscured the higher ranges, leaving Douglas to follow at his leisure. The view from the ridge will ever live in my memory as one of the most striking I know from a long range, because not only was it of surpassing grandeur, but of more than ordinary interest. In the first place, no one could suppose from a distance that there was room for more than a small valley here, but on closer inspection, there proved to be not only a broad valley and glacier, but a comparatively large tributary valley. The reason of this is that the ranges are of exceptional steepness and very narrow, allowing room for broad valleys between. The point on which we were standing was upwards of 5,000 feet above sea level, and overlooking a quadrangular basin 7 miles in length, and increasing in breadth from 1 mile at the upper to 2 miles at the lower end, the floor of which lay 2,500 feet below. A spur from the Balfour Range, and that on which we were standing, forms the western wall of this basin, a deep gorge having been cut through it by the river. Craig's Range and the Balfour Ranges form the northern and southern sides respectively, while the eastern end is blocked by the stupendous buttresses of Mount Tasman. On the north and south of the valley the sides rise in rocky precipices to the height of more than 2,000 feet, and at the western end Mount Tasman rises fully 7,000 feet, its black and frowning cliffs only relieved by one small ice field, which lies halfway up its sides. The small glacier is apparently of second-rate importance, but so far as was then known, it formed the neve of the Balfour. That a large glacier 6 miles long should draw its supplies from so small a neve was more than doubtful, and I was of opinion that the snowfield which we could see between the Balfour Range and Mount Dampier would prove to be the real neve coming through some unsuspected gap in that range. This point we could not determine from here, and hoped to finally settle it by going up the glacier. There is only one small floe of ice joining the neve and trunk of this glacier. Most of the ice drops over a cliff over 1,000 feet in height, bringing with it a great deal of debris, which covers the glacier with heavy moraine for its whole length. Over the Balfour Range, Mounts Dampier, Hicks, and Stokes could be seen, with Harper's Saddle at the head of the Hooker Glacier, and behind again, dominating all, was the upper part of Mount Cook. These great peaks rose in apparently a wall, within 7 miles of us, 7,000 or 8,000 feet of their height being visible. The original name given to Mount Stokes was La Perouse, and it seems a pity to have changed it. How appropriate the latter name is cannot be realized better than from Craig's Spur, because from this point there is a group of peaks standing alone, and from their position dwarfing all others. This group could hardly be surpassed, and being all closely connected, should have similar names. At present the name Stokes spoils the uniformity, and if La Perouse were again adopted, we should be able to call the group of 5 navigators, namely Tasman, 11,475 feet, Dampier, 11,323 feet, Cook, 12,349 feet, Hicks, 10,410 feet, and La Perouse, 10,101 feet. Fortunately, I had an hour or two on the top to obtain photographs before 9:30, when the fog closed in upon us. Douglas having arrived in due course, we began our descent over steep, treacherous grass slopes and bare rocks, and in 2 hours arrived at the terminal moraine of the glacier, and pitched our fly, having left the batwing behind to lighten our loads. When travelling with a fly only, we arrange it as follows. Placing a pole horizontally, about 5 feet from the ground between 2 uprights, we hang the canvas over and peg it to the ground behind, giving it a slope of 45 degrees. The front is then stretched out and the corners made fast at 3 feet, and the centre at 4 feet from the ground. The 2 ends of this lean-to are blocked with screens of scrub and fern, making walls of about 3 feet in width. Under the back part we place our bedding, which consists of twigs, branches, and grass, and kindle our fire in the shelter of the front portion. The bed is about the same size as in our batwing, namely 6 feet by 4 feet, and on turning in we lie heads and tails in our blanket bags. This shelter is practically the same as our batwings, only with walls of fern at the ends instead of canvas, but it has the disadvantage of only a single instead of a double canvas roof. To remedy this in heavy rain, we make a large screen of ferns or grass, and fix it about 6 inches above the back portion, letting it act as the fly does in the batwing camp. However good the quality of canvas, a certain amount of moisture always comes through in heavy rain, either in drops where the roof has been touched, or in fine spray, hence the necessity of an extra roof over the portion in which we sit or sleep. A single piece of oiled canvas would be waterproof in any weather, but has not sufficient lasting qualities, for it dries and cracks in a few weeks, and being nearly twice as heavy as ordinary canvas, it is just as convenient to take 2 pieces of the latter, if one takes any. Our camp was situated on the bank of McKenna's Creek, which drains some ice fields on Craig's Peak, and the range to the east. The valley in which the creek flows is broad and flat for 2.5 miles, and is separated from the Balfour Glacier by an ice-worn, narrow ridge which we named Hen and Chickens, descending from 1,500 feet at the upper end of the valley to 500 feet at the lower end. This ridge has been abraded by ice on both sides, and on the top for a greater part of its length. A few chains below our camp, the creek joins the Balfour River, at a point about 1/4 mile below the glacier. After leaving the ice, the river flows on a fairly level course through a series of terminal moraines, some of no great antiquity. There are 5 terraces of old lateral moraines along the lower part of the glacier, and 3 of these have their corresponding semicircular terminal moraines, from which the position of the glacier at different periods of its existence can be determined. The highest terrace of these 5 was formed by the ice when the glacier reached the present gorge, or possibly when it pushed its way still further through the narrow outlet. Almost immediately below the inflow of McKenna's Creek, the valley begins a rapid descent, and the river becomes a rushing torrent over, under, and through large erratic boulders, until 1/2 mile below it leaps into a gloomy gorge walled by sheer rocky precipices of fully 1,000 feet. Though I could see generally that the gorge narrowed and descended very rapidly, and also the enormous precipices overhead, it was impossible, owing to scrub and boulders, to obtain a photograph of more than a general idea of the gorge. It is a most helpless feeling to get mixed up with the large boulders met with in such places. One feels like Gulliver in his journeys amongst the giants, and can often neither get under or over one of these smooth-sided obstacles. The Balfour joins Cook River about 3 miles from the glacier, and must have a descent of 1,500 feet in a little under 2 miles while passing through the gorge. On March 22nd, we traversed the glacier from the terminal face to the foot of the precipices off Tasman, Douglas taking the southern and I the northern side. Rain, however, set in at noon, and by 3 p.m., when we reached the foot of Tasman, the clouds were so low that we could see nothing. It was therefore impossible to clear up the doubt about the neve of the glacier, but we still inclined to the opinion that the snowfield from Mount Hicks found an outlet into the Balfour, otherwise it was difficult to account for so large a trunk. The ice was completely covered with surface moraine, nearly every stone of which sparkled with minute crystals, and some of the larger stones bristled with crystals an inch long. My diary entry for March 23rd begins as follows, quote, 2½ miles of creek bed, 700 feet climb at the end, 55 minutes exciting race with fog, thought I'd done it, sold, end quote. Such races with the fog to obtain bearings or photographs from a high point were constantly taking place, and I think the fog has won as often as I have. On this particular occasion, I wanted to get a clear view from a point at the head of McKenna's Creek, which should finally settle the doubt with regard to the Balfour neve. My route lay through some rather bad scrub for 200 yards, and then along an open creek bed for 2¼ miles to the foot of a saddle, which lay nearly 700 feet above the creek. I took Betsy the dog, who, by the way, rejoined us after leaving the Waiho, and travelled at a jog trot to the foot of the grassy slope of the saddle, because I had seen a small insignificant piece of fog form and disappear again on Ryan's Peak below the gorge. By the time the foot of the saddle had been reached, a dense bank of fog was crawling through the Balfour Gorge, and had apparently met an opposing current of air from McKenna's Creek, as it remained stationary to all appearances at the lower end of the valley. The saddle I was making for lay on the above-mentioned ice-worn rocky ridge, between the creek and the glacier, and as it would be only 3 or 4 miles from Tasman's Great Cliffs, it ought to command a grand view of the western face of that peak. I had just begun the ascent, when a wisp of fog came over the top of the ridge through another saddle, and I realized that though it had stopped at the end of McKenna Valley, it was passing up the Balfour Glacier on the far side of the Hen and Chickens. Never did I travel uphill so fast before. Betsy, now barking and biting my heels, now running ahead, was madly excited, while I scrambled frantically up to get at least one photograph. The fog now crept along the McKenna Valley, and was close up to me when I reached the bridge thoroughly done, having travelled just over 2 miles along the creek, and climbed 700 feet in 55 minutes, with 20 pounds of camera instruments, etc. on my back. It was all to no purpose, however, for though I had raced the fog behind in the McKenna Valley, it had crawled up along the Balfour Ridge, and only allowed me a momentary glimpse of Tasman's giant buttresses, obscuring everything above the 6,000-foot level before I could get my camera out of its case. "Did you swear?" I am generally asked when relating this experience. No, I did not say anything at all. I merely upset a large rock lying near me over the 800-foot precipice onto the Balfour Glacier to relieve my mind, and then lay down to recover my wind. It happens so often, this mad rush uphill to forestall the fog, that one gets used to disappointments. The only way to secure good photographs is to reach the point by 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, and sit down quietly until the light improves. Directly the first bit of fog forms anywhere in sight, a set of plates ought to be exposed, whether the light is good or bad. Never wait till the last minute, but secure one set at least, and if the fog does give a farther chance of exposing in better light, then take another set. I have seen the whole landscape blotted out within 3 minutes of the first sign of fog, and as I was waiting till the last minute to let the light improve, I was on that occasion badly sold, and never again did I omit to make one complete set of exposures on arrival. The rocks above me on Craig's Range were broken into very fantastic shapes, and numerous detached blocks lay on the Hens and Chickens, which I believe to have been left by the ancient glacier. Betsy and I spent 2 hours on the ridge, trying to catch some kias, and also dropping stones over the great precipice onto the glacier below. A most fascinating occupation is this, of rolling stones from a great height. Douglas and I have spent hours, when waiting for a fog to lift in various places, rolling down large rocks, and working as hard as if our lives depended on it to dislodge one of exceptional dimensions. We often used to try and suggest some reason which would account for the fascination, for I suppose it may be said to be universal. I have never met a man, even amongst those who spend their whole lives on these hills, who did not only thoroughly enjoy seeing a stone career madly down a slope, but who would not go to considerable trouble to start one rolling. On returning along McKenna's Creek, we got 2 ducks, but the dog took them both to the far side of the creek, and left them there, compelling me to wade across for them, a cold task, as the stream was ice-fed, and took me up to the waist. Douglas, some years before I joined him, used to work alone, and had a wonderfully clever and awful useful dog named Topsy, which used to keep him well supplied with birds. She would go away to hunt as soon as he began to pitch camp, and return with 3 birds, 2 for her master and 1 for herself. It would be a very poor locality for birds if she couldn't find any. A better forager never existed. In another way, too, she proved useful. Douglas says that when going up a river he might find a rocky bluff rising out of the water, which seemed likely to necessitate a high climb. In order to avoid the risk of going forward some distance and being compelled to return, owing to an impassable corner, he would send Topsy ahead and sit down for a smoke till she came back. On her return, he could always tell from her manner whether the route was practicable round the bluff. So well did she know what he could do, that on one occasion she gave him to understand that there was no possibility of going round, but as he was anxious to avoid the high climb through the bush, over the bluff, he picked up his load and started off to find his way round. Topsy, who was lying down, merely looked up, and seeing him going where she had been, stayed where she was, and made no attempt to follow, knowing her master would have to return to that spot to begin his climb over. When Douglas came back, having failed, he said Topsy got up, stretched herself, and followed him up the hillside, with a superior smile on her face. The weather became very threatening on the 24th, so we decided to get out of this valley before a storm came on and stopped us, as provisions were coming to an end, and we had done all that was necessary. The very steep grass slopes and smooth rock faces, up which we had to go to reach the spur again, were treacherous, and would have been very dangerous but for our ice axes. It was annoying to have to take such a high and roundabout route to and from this glacier, when, had the gorge been passable, it would have only taken an hour or 2 to reach the junction with Cook River, instead of a long day. On Easter Sunday the storm came on, so we pushed along from our bivouac, where we slept on the previous evening, and reached Ryan's hut before dark. A week's bad weather followed, putting all the streams into high flood. Therefore we had good reason to congratulate ourselves on having got out of the Balfour Valley in time, for another day's delay, and we should have been cornered like rats in a trap without the cheese. One evening some of the diggers working up Cook River above the cage, who had been down to town, Gillespie's, called in at the hut on their way back, and stayed for the night. Conversation turned to ice work, and after explaining the use of our axes, I began to give them a rough idea of the effects of glaciers. In the course of the conversation I spoke of the Tasman Glacier, and one of those present said, "Is the Tasman as large as the Fox River?" "Oh yes, much larger," I said. "Is it on a big river too?" said another. To which I replied, "Yes, the Waitaki." "What a rum thing," said the last speaker, "it is that nearly all the glaciers are on rivers." "It is curious," I said humbly, feeling ashamed that my discourse had not conveyed a better idea of the causes and effects of glaciers. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand by Arthur Paul Harper. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 7. Cook River, Fox Glacier. Slight mishap. Douglas, the Chancellor Ridge, Victoria Glacier, Keas. Fogged again. Even when out of the ranges, our communication with the civilized world was casual. A weekly pack-horse mail came as far as Gillespie's Beach, and was generally punctual, except when rain put some of the rivers in flood, which occurred about twice out of 5 trips, and then we had to be thankful if there was only a week's delay. In addition to this, many of the inhabitants at Gillespie's are not on speaking terms, and as we relied on the thoughtfulness of someone coming up to the hut to bring our letters, it often happened that the person who came had not been to the post office, because he was not on good terms with the people there. On returning from the Balfour Valley, we found letters awaiting us in the hut, urging that our reports be completed and sent to the office in Hokitika before we again went into the ranges. This took some days, and when I had completed my portion of the writing, I decided to go to the Fox Glacier and work there until Douglas had finished his report and could join me. Regardless of possible bad luck, I left Ryan's hut on All Fool's Day, 1894, with Johnny Ryan, taking food for a fortnight, batwing, etc., in 2 40-pound loads on a pack horse. The snout of the Fox Glacier, which lies 670 feet above sea level, is easily reached, but at present a horse cannot be taken within a mile of the ice. If, however, a track was cleared through the bush, there would be little need of formation, and a horse could go to the terminal face with little trouble. At 1.5 miles below the glacier, I sent Ryan back with the horses, as they were of no further use, and leaving one load to bring up later, I started up the river with the other. The travelling was rather rougher than I expected, and it was 2 p.m. before I found a good camping place amongst some rata bushes near a tributary creek. Returning for and bringing up the second load occupied another 2 hours, leaving just enough daylight to clear a space and pitch the batwing. When there is a probability of staying more than one night in a camp, we put some flat stones under the fire to keep it dry, and also a few between the bedding and the fire, as it is more comfortable and cleaner than the bare, damp ground. Intending to be here for a week at least, I made the camp as snug as possible before dark, and having had a meal, proceeded to read the papers which had come up by the mail before I left Ryan's. The Fox Glacier had been visited during the previous 25 years by many who were either in search of fine scenery or gold, but no one had been beyond the terminal face. The map then existing, as in the case of most of the western watershed, was made from distant trigonometrical stations on the sea bluffs and lower hills, and I anticipated some interesting work on such a large field of virgin ice. It was a decided drawback being alone, but still, one man can do a great deal by himself with due care, even on a glacier. The valley is broader than that of the Franz Josef. The northern side rises nearly sheer from the ice, in high precipitous hills, a considerable amount of bare, ice-worn rock showing here and there through the dark vegetation. The southern side for the first 3 miles slopes gently back from the glacier for some distance, showing several old lateral moraines and terraces to the foot of Craig's Range, which rises abruptly for some 3,000 or 4,000 feet. The terraces and hillsides are clothed with dense bush and scrub to the usual altitude. On the right-hand side of the terminal face, when approaching the glacier, a large isolated rock stands in the center of the valley, which appears to be a perfect cone from below, but is in reality a narrow, glacier-worn ridge of nearly a mile in length. The ice, which, at a comparatively recent date, divided and flowed down on each side of the rock, now only flows along its northern face. The Cone Rock, as we named it, is 825 feet from base to summit, and shows marks of abrasion by ice all over it, with a number of huge erratic boulders strewn along its narrow ridge. These, however, are not seen until one is on the top, because the trees grow to a considerable size wherever they can obtain a hold. On the south side, a large creek, coming off Craig's Range, down a steep course, flows against the cone and is turned at right angles to its original direction, and continuing along the foot of the rock for a mile, joins the main river a few yards below the glacier. About half a mile from the river, up this creek, I made my camp, at the foot of the Cone Rock, in a nice patch of rata trees. The first thing to do next morning was to ascend the rock, and obtain a good general view of the glacier, to form some idea of the route to take up the ice. On reaching the top, I found it heaped with large erratic blocks, lying in hopeless confusion on one another along the narrow ridge, and sometimes from their size and position rather troublesome. Fine rata trees were growing amongst and on the top of these, and prevented my getting a clear view or opening for a photograph. I generally use my ice axe, by an arrangement of my own, for a camera stand, never carrying a tripod, as we must economize weight in every way. Here, however, a stand would have been useless, for the trees were too large, so climbing a rata until I could overlook its neighbors, I arranged cross sticks between 2 branches and made 3 exposures, one of which ultimately proved very good, the others having been spoilt by movement. From such a central position as the cone, a capital idea of the glacier can be obtained. Of the dividing range, Glacier Peak and Hedinger could be seen rising out of the neve, while more to the right the top of Tasman was visible over Craig's Peak. From the neve the ice descends over a good icefall, part of which is in view from the cone, and thence for 3 or 4 miles the glacier flows white and smooth to the terminal face. 2 small portions of broken ice form the only apparent obstacles to easy travel as far as the great icefall. In the map then existing, the Fox Glacier was shown as flowing down in 2 large streams, divided by the Chancellor Ridge, a branch of the Bismarck Range. The southern ice flow drained the dividing range, and the northern came from the snowfields of Bismarck's Peak. I had fully anticipated a magnificent view of 2 great ice falls descending on each side of the Chancellor Ridge and joining at its base, but there was nothing of the kind visible from the cone, presumably because the northern stream, or Victoria Glacier, flowed at a lower level and joined the Fox without an ice fall. Below the Chancellor Ridge, the descent of the glacier is gradual, not nearly so steep as the Franz Josef, and its course is over a smoother bed. No obstacles, apparently, to cause such broken waves and undulations as were seen on its neighbour. Having decided on the best route to follow in order to reach the Chancellor Ridge, I climbed from my high perch in the rata tree to the ground. Though not very superstitious, I have 1 or 2 harmless ideas about luck, and one is that the 1st of April is an unlucky day to start on an expedition. However, up to this point all had gone well. I had a good camp, plenty of provisions, the promise of a day or 2 of really fine weather, and a fine glacier to explore. But such good fortune was not to last, for on descending from the top of the cone, I had to go along a ledge overhanging a drop of about 25 feet, in the middle of which a single tree had to be passed. Catching a branch in one hand, I was in the act of swinging round on the outside when the limb broke and sent me backwards over the drop, at the bottom of which I landed with one leg somewhere under my back. Before rising, I naturally looked at my camera, which was under me with some apprehension, and found it unhurt, but on getting up to go on, the pain in my ankle showed that it had been badly twisted. There is only one thing to do in a case like this, namely, keep moving, to prevent the joint from stiffening. An hour's hobbling brought me to camp, where I filled the billy with water, cut 2 days' supply of firewood, and generally fixed up the camp before resting. Within a quarter of an hour of sitting down, I could not put my foot to the ground, and had the pleasure of lying in camp during the 3rd and 4th, before I could move about at all freely. An accident like this, though slight, would be quite enough to lead to fatal results if it occurred far away from camp, because no anxiety would be felt by those on the low country for a week or 2 at least. Generally, indeed, 2 or 3 months might pass before a search party would be organized, as we often do not know how long we are going to be away. Even allowing that a search party was sent out within a week or 2, they would not know where to begin operations, as the country would only be known to the object of their search. Douglas, who has in the past done most of his explorations alone, has been fortunate, except in 1 or 2 cases, one of which would have proved fatal but for his extraordinary pluck and determination. It was, if I recollect rightly from his account, in the 70s that he was crossing the swamp between the Karangarua and Cook River, jumping from "Niggerhead" to "Niggerhead," when he slipped and sprained his ankle badly. He only had a little oatmeal with him, and was nearly 2 weeks before he could get to Hunt's Beach, the nearest habitation. On coming some days after to the river Karangarua, he found it was rising, for rain had been falling, but in spite of his ankle and the fact that he couldn't swim, he crossed that evening and reached the hut thoroughly exhausted. He says it was a case of neck or nothing, because had he not crossed that night, the river would have been too high, and a day or 2 more of exposure would have been too much for him. Had he had any matches to kindle a fire, he would have got on much better, but even though it had been raining most of the time, he was without fire and only a little shelter. Making a crossbow, he killed 2 pigeons, but the bow soon lost its spring, and except these 2 birds, he had to rely on 3 pounds of oatmeal and a chew or 2 of tobacco. Had the accident occurred in the bush, probably more birds could have been obtained and a good shelter built, but this was in an almost open swamp. The fact that my little mishap and Douglas's accident turned out to be harmless is no excuse for working alone, nor does it alter the rule that a man should never go into rough country, away from habitation, by himself. But we cannot always act according to rules, however sound they are. It is often a choice of doing the work alone or not at all,
and if no one took any risk, the country would be unexplored for years. I must plead guilty to having done a fair amount of solitary work, and to liking it quite as well as, if not better than, with a companion, but I admit that it is a mistake. On the 5th, I went up the glacier some 3 miles, to a point where the icefall could be seen to advantage. The route lay up the creek from camp for half a mile or so to the upper end of the Cone Rock, though at the time I did not anticipate more than 300 yards before reaching the ice. A few chains below the end of the rock, the creek bed turns at right angles up Craig's Range, from which it flows, and at the bend there is an old watercourse from the glacier into the creek, down which there has been an outflow of water from the ice at no distant date. By taking this route, a rough piece of going is avoided, caused by the Cone Rock having compressed the glacier into a narrow channel. As far as the ice is concerned, one can get on or off almost anywhere along the sides, except where high rocky precipices render it impossible to land. Travelling on the glacier is easy to anyone accustomed to ice work, and it only has to be left once in order to skirt a small icefall nearly 3 miles up. Here there was, so late in the year, a short piece of complicated work amongst crevasses. About 1.5 miles from the terminal face, there is a quarter of an hour of roughish ice, which had to be manoeuvred rather carefully, but which would give no trouble whatever earlier in the year. Soon after midday I had reached the small icefall, and having thus far seen no sign of the ice of the Victoria Glacier, I began to suspect some great error in the map. Landing on the south side, immediately below the rough ice, 30 minutes climbing and crawling over large boulders, forming a lateral moraine, brought me to the rocky point of a spur off Craig's Peak, round the foot of which the glacier bends. From this point of vantage, looking across to the Chancellor Ridge, it was evident that no tributary ice stream joined the main glacier, nor indeed did it appear that any glacier existed behind the ridge, because no water was visible coming over the rocks. The glacier is narrower here than its neighbour, but its total average width is slightly more, the surface ice is good, and though hummocky, is fairly free from crevasses. The only surface moraine is at the terminal face, which is covered from side to side for perhaps 150 yards up the glacier. It would be necessary to cross over the Chancellor Ridge in order to settle the doubt concerning the Victoria Glacier, but my ankle was still too weak for a long day's work, so I returned to camp. On the following day, I got up at dawn, intending to take blanket and provisions for a bivouac on the Chancellor Ridge, but the foot was still stiff and required another day's spell. Therefore, after going halfway up to a small icefall, I gave it best and went back to camp. It was evident that the sore ankle would not allow much work if I carried even a light load, so I decided to only take a quarter-plate camera and 1 day's food and trust to luck in the shape of a good stone, if necessary to sleep out on the Chancellor Ridge. Leaving camp at dawn, or 6 a.m. on the 7th, I reached the rock bluff below the icefall in 2 hours, and went on to the foot of the fall to see if any practicable route could be found up to the neve. Though not stupendously broken as the upper part of the Franz Joseph, the icefall of the Fox Glacier would be better left alone, as the seracs are large and constantly falling. Turning back again towards the lower end of the Chancellor Ridge, I intended to cross it, and if possible go up some peak or saddle on the Bismarck Range to command a view of the Fritz Glacier and head of the Waikukupa River. At the lower end of the ridge it was easy to reach the side, which is of smooth rock, sloping gently under the ice. About, above and below, the glacier is lined by sheer, and in places overhanging precipices of 400 or 500 feet in height. At the foot of this rocky wall the ice flows level and unbroken. It was not rotten or crevassed, as is the usual case at the side of a glacier. In one place it was possible to walk up to the foot of the cliff, and, standing on the ice, lean my back against the rock, only a foot or less space intervening. The ice is evidently of great depth at the side here, which accounts for its unbroken surface, and the rock must be perpendicular for a considerable distance below the level of the glacier. It was now evident that there was a fair-sized glacier in the valley between the Chancellor Ridge and the Bismarck Range, as a large stream of dirty water fell over the precipices, making a fine waterfall. It had worn a curiously shaped funnel down the face, which completely hid the stream until quite close to it, and which accounted for my not seeing it from the opposite side of the glacier. The old saying, "more haste, less speed," is generally true, but never more so than in new country, as I have often found to my cost. After leaving the ice and being in too great a hurry to reach a good point of view into the valley beyond the Chancellor Ridge, I began to climb up and across the lower end of the spur. This is very steep and rotten, and the whole face being shattered rock, it was not without considerable trouble that I reached the arête, having got into one or two decidedly ticklish places. In half an hour I topped the ridge, and could see into the valley beyond, where lay, 300 feet below me, the Victoria Glacier, slightly over 4 miles in length, and about 30 chains in breadth, covered with a very heavy surface moraine for a third of its length. This glacier comes off the Bismarck Range, from Bismarck's Peak and Mount Anderegg, with 2 tributary glaciers, from the Chancellor Ridge on the south, and from a long offshoot of Anderegg on the north. It flows past the end of the Chancellor onto a plateau, 3,685 feet, lying at the top of the perpendicular rocky wall already described, which rises out of the Fox Glacier. Large erratic boulders lie scattered on the plateau, amongst dense mountain scrub and grass, showing that in the past the Victoria found its way over the cliffs to the main ice flow of the Fox. As it exists at present, the Victoria is as perfect an example of a small primary glacier as could be found, with its little neve, tributary ice streams, and complete system of surface, lateral, and terminal moraines. I had been looking for a likely alpine pass to the Tasman Valley since the beginning of the season, and had come to the conclusion that for all practical purposes the Franz Josef Glacier had better be left alone, so far as its lower extremity was concerned. There now appeared to be a good route up the Victoria Glacier, over a low col, to the head of the Fritz Glacier, and thence, behind Roon, to the head of the Melchior, a branch of the Franz Josef Glacier, and then across the broad neve basin of the latter, over Graham's Saddle, near De la Beche, down the Rudolph Glacier to the Tasman. I had been close up to Graham's Saddle from the Tasman, and knew the Franz Josef Glacier and the Victoria, so excepting the col over the Bismarck Range, there was little new ground to cover. Therefore, while I was in Christchurch during the winter following this trip, I tried to persuade someone to come and make this pass, and though Mr. Fife arranged to join me, he was at the last moment unable to do so. However, I am glad to say, I ultimately had the satisfaction of being one of the party to make the first complete pass, as will be seen later, when I told Mr. Fitzgerald of the route, and with him and Zurbriggen crossed it a year later. Ever since sunrise, I had been the object of considerable attention from some kias, or mountain parrots. At first only 2 or 3, but afterwards their number had increased to 15 or more. They joined me on the south side of the Fox Glacier, and annoyed me considerably by their inquisitiveness while I was taking some bearings and photographs, one of them alighting on my back just as I was looking through the compass. These birds are not found except in high country, and their eggs are very rare, as they probably choose some crevice in the face of a precipice for their nesting place. They have cruel beaks and great power in them, being able to tear any cloth with a single stroke, but are tame and harmless, except in certain localities where they kill sheep. This weakness of theirs has given them a bad name, and it is generally supposed that all kias are naturally inclined to attack sheep. Such, however, is not the case. The fault lay in the first instance with shepherds or persons who had to skin the sheep on the station. Kias naturally feed on berries, but they are possessed of an intense desire to investigate everything they see, and if possible tear it with their beaks. Consequently, near homesteads in Otago and Canterbury, when they see sheepskins hanging up to dry, they go down to examine them. If the skins are carefully cleaned, little harm results, but if not, the kias have a chance to taste the fat, and when once a kia tastes fat, he is a ruined bird, and would sell his soul, if he had one, to get more. To satisfy this craving, he attacks the sheep with fatal effect, causing in some localities very heavy loss to the stations. Note: these birds, when attacking live sheep, settle on the back of the animal and deliberately drive their beaks into the skin until they have reached the kidney fat. They never wound a sheep in any other part of the body. End of note. The birds are not migratory, and as far as I have been able to ascertain, rarely leave the valleys they live in. This is evidenced by the fact that while some stations lose many sheep, owing to the kias, an adjoining owner may suffer no loss whatever, owing to the fact that the birds have not learnt the taste for fat. When crossing the Chancellor Ridge, the keas which I referred to followed me on the wing, but owing to the ice being very slippery, my progress was too slow for them. Therefore, alighting on the ice, they began to follow on foot. Whenever a kea makes its appearance, we are prepared for some good fun, as their actions are most ludicrous, and their conversation, which is incessant, is almost expressive enough to enable one to understand what they mean. I have had considerable experience with these birds, but have never seen such an intensely funny proceeding as on this particular morning. The keas, having settled on the ice, began to follow in a long straggling line, about 15 of them. They have a preternaturally solemn walk, but when in a hurry they hop along on both feet, looking very eager and very much in earnest. To see these 15 birds hopping along behind in a string, as if their very lives depended on keeping me in sight, was ridiculously comic. The ice was undulating, with little valleys and hummocks, and the birds would now, for a second or two, disappear into a hollow, and now show up on a hummock, pause for a moment, and then hop down again out of sight into the next hollow. To judge by their expressions and manner, they were in a great state of anxiety on emerging from a hollow onto a hummock as to whether I was still there. Now and then the one in front would appear, craning his neck, and on seeing me still ahead would turn round and shriek, "Yah!" as much as to say, "It's all right, boys, come up and along." And the others, putting their heads down, would set their teeth and travel all they knew, a fat one in the rear evidently making very heavy weather of it. On the Chancellor Ridge they became offensively inquisitive, and I really could hardly take any photographs owing to their anxiety to ascertain the maker's name on my camera. However, such is the perversity of affairs in general, that it was only when it occurred to me that a picture of 10 or 15 keas examining my ice axe would be interesting, that they suddenly seemed to remember an appointment elsewhere and disappeared. Had the idea occurred a few minutes earlier, a good picture could have been obtained. After having descended to the Victoria Glacier, I saw a small cloud appearing on Craig's Range, which warned me that the usual fog was coming, so I hastened back to the ridge and along it to a point from which I could get a view over the neve of the Fox Glacier. The climb gradually developed into a race with the mists creeping up the valley behind me. On reaching the top, I was rewarded by a momentary but magnificent view of Haidinger and the great northern face of Tasman, before the fog descended like a curtain and shut everything from view, leaving no time to take a photograph. I have been fortunate enough to have been all over the central part of our Alps, and to have seen the great peaks, both far and near from every side, and I think the northern face of Mount Tasman is as fine as anything I know, except perhaps Mount Sefton. It rises out of the neve of the Fox Glacier in great round precipices, capped with hanging glaciers, and the graceful curves of the summit are unsurpassed for beauty. When the fog had once closed in and shut out surrounding objects, it is really little use waiting for it to clear, but for some reason I always hope against hope, and spend a miserable hour or two under a rock before finally giving it up as useless. On this occasion I stayed for nearly 2 hours on the side of the ridge, now and then catching a fleeting glimpse of the main glacier far below me, winding in ghostly whiteness down the valley, and beyond it the sea with its 2 or 3 lines of breakers crawling in towards the beach. Of the upper portion of the valley nothing was again visible, beyond one tantalizing peep of Tasman's mighty shoulders appearing over the fog. At 1:30 I could not see an object 15 yards away, and the dry fog changed to a wet mist, a sure sign of an approaching storm, so I began to cast about for a shelter in which to spend the night, and from which to make an ascent on the Bismarck Range, if the morrow proved fine. However, in half an hour, the drifting mist having wetted my clothes completely, I gave up all idea of staying out for the night, and decided to get back to my camp without delay. End of chapter 7.